Hello fellow sapiens, a quiet welcome to Midnight Sapien. Whether you're spiralling softly into sleep, watching shadows pass beside a campfire glow, or walking alone beneath distant stars, this space is for you. Because tonight, we're stepping into the brutal, beautiful world of Ice Age men and asking what it took to survive. This is calm storytelling for curious minds and cold bones. It is a story mostly buried, a story carved into broken spines and scattered teeth, a story of sons born into hunger, of brothers lost to the hunt, of fathers who stood watch while others slept. It stretches across 700,000 winters and echoes in the bones of those who never made it through. But survival is never what we think it is. It was not about dominance, not about strength alone. It was endurance, layered, fragile, and full of pain. And if you're the kind of human who likes long-form, slow science, and prehistoric mystery, consider tapping like and subscribe. It helps this strange little corner of the internet reach other sapiens out there in the dark. Now I wonder, what time is it for you right now, and where in the world are you listening from? If you feel like sharing, I'd love to read it in the comments. It reminds me how many of us there are, scattered across time zones but connected by curiosity. And if sleep comes, let it. Timestamps are in the description, so you can always return. Now we begin with a boy born into ice. Before he learned to hunt or speak or lead, a boy in the Ice Age had to do something far more improbable. He had to survive being born male. That alone was a quiet gamble against extinction. And it is here, in the first flickering hours of life, that the story of Ice Age men must begin. Not with glory, not with strength, but with fragility. Because survival, for them, was never guaranteed. It was a wager whispered in blood and breath, and from the very start the odds leaned against them. Across almost every mammalian species, including our own, male infants have always been more likely to die young. In cold climates, the risk deepens. Metabolic demands rise, resources stretch thin, and under these conditions boys are statistically more vulnerable, less resilient to infection, more sensitive to stress in the womb, slower to develop vital systems. In the archaeological record, this imbalance reveals itself not in grand discoveries, but in the silence of the graves. Tiny bones, scattered ratios, burial sites like Kostenki, Sungia, and Dolni Vestonice suggest an ancient, persistent pattern. For every girl who did not survive infancy, more boys were lost. The frost claimed them first. But why? Biologists trace part of the answer to the Y chromosome, a solitary, unpaired strand that carries little redundancy. If something goes wrong, there is no backup. In utero, male fetuses are more prone to miscarriage. At birth, their immune systems lag slightly behind. Their bodies grow faster, yes, but that speed comes at a cost. Even today, in neonatal wards from Norway to Namibia, male mortality is higher. In prehistory, without doctors or incubators or antibiotics, the cost would have been absolute. And still, the birth of a boy meant hope, meant potential, meant a future hunter, a carrier of lineages, a bearer of tools and stories. So when one did survive, the world adjusted to his presence. He became something to protect, or to harden. Because the Ice Age did not reward softness. Even in infancy, boys born into the cold entered a world where warmth was rationed, where breath fogged the air like smoke, where survival demanded more than love. It demanded fuel, fat, fire, and quiet strength. But strength is not given, it is honed. And so the earliest shaping began not with ceremony, but with exposure, to cold, to hunger, to noise, to the grinding pressure of life that had no time for fragility. The boy who lived had already passed his first trial, unseen, unsung, and utterly vital. The boy who lived had already passed his first trial, unseen, unsung, and utterly vital. His birth was not a beginning, but a continuation of a narrow thread that stretched backward through time, a thread held by the few who had endured enough to pass it forward. What does it mean, then, to be born into a lineage shaped by catastrophe? To inherit not ease, but attrition? The fossil record tells a quiet but persistent truth. Survival was not equally distributed. In harsh Ice Age environments, male survival was taxed more heavily from the very start. They were larger at birth, metabolically more demanding, and more susceptible to complications in utero. In a world where every calorie mattered, where mothers often bore children while still healing from the last, the arrival of a male child may have required more than joy. It required a wager, one that might cost the lives of both. And still, across continents and millennia, they were born. From the frozen steppes of what is now Ukraine to the mist-wrapped forests of ancient Java, the record shows us the same fragile beginning, repeated endlessly. Tiny femurs, curved and unfinished, jawbones with barely formed teeth. Some were wrapped in ochre, some were laid beside beads or blades. Some, we imagine, were simply left behind. But the pattern is there, in the burial ratios of the Upper Paleolithic, in the subtle skew of sex-based mortality that persists in ancient DNA, in the quiet arithmetic of lives too short to be remembered, yet still etched into the statistical architecture of our species. Why would evolution allow such fragility to persist? Should not natural selection have hardened these children until their odds equalled those of their sisters? Or was there something else at play? Something deeper than symmetry? The answer may lie in the nature of reproductive risk itself. In a dangerous world, a female who survives to adulthood can reproduce with relative reliability. But a male, his success is uncertain. In many small-scale societies, past and present, a few males father many children while others leave none. This creates what evolutionary biologists call high variance, and with it, intense pressure on early survival. Not every male child needed to live. But those who did, those who endured frostbite, fever and famine, became the carriers of legacy, the survivors of a brutal filter, the next link in a hard chain. And what happens when survival is its own inheritance? When the very act of continuing shapes the bodies and behaviours of those who come after? In the bones of Ice Age men, we begin to see the answer. Thicker cortical walls, enlarged muscle attachments, signs of rapid growth followed by early arrest. Bodies sculpted by necessity, minds that emerged within the narrow corridor between stillbirth and starvation. What kind of man begins as a burden, and becomes somehow the one who must carry? He's shaped not by ease, but by escalation. Every hour lived beyond birth becomes another test. Cold creeps into the lungs. Cries attract attention not only from kin, but from predators. The nourishment needed to grow a male body, dense muscle, thick bone, expanding brain, must be pulled from an environment already strained. Mothers, themselves underfed, must produce more milk. Group members must gather or hunt more food. A single boy's survival bends the bandwidth of the group, and so, perhaps without realizing it, the people around him begin to select, not with violence, but with vigilance. Who is strong? Who is too costly? Who do we fight to keep warm? Who do we grieve and move on from? Natural selection does not always act through death. Sometimes it acts through exhaustion, through accumulation, through tiny decisions made again and again under pressure. In modern foraging groups like the Hadza or the Inuit, ethnographers have observed subtle differences in the care given to children under extreme duress, not from cruelty but from triage. In the Ice Age, where lifespans were shorter and communities smaller, every child mattered. But not every child could be saved. The biology of maleness, so often associated with strength and advantage in adulthood, came at a steep cost in childhood. Vulnerability was the price of potential, and yet some survived. Enough survived. Because there was something else being shaped alongside the body. Something invisible, but just as real. A psychology of early adversity. A kind of mental callus. The boy who was cold before he could walk, who learned stillness not from teaching but from instinct, who cried less because crying brought nothing. That boy was being prepared for the landscape ahead, and it was not only the cold or the wolves or the hunger that required this preparation, it was the role he would be expected to play. From as early as 3 or 4 years old, Ice Age children began to shadow the movements of adults, not by command, but by immersion. There were no lectures, no tutorials. Learning was absorption. The act of watching, stone shaping, fire tending, skin scraping became rehearsal. And for boys especially, it was a rehearsal under heightened stakes. Their future tasks would demand proximity to danger. Their education was physical, mimetic and unforgiving. One slip with a hand axe, one misstep near a flame. These were not mistakes corrected with timeouts or scolding, these were injuries, and still they pressed closer, imitating the balance of their elders, the grip on a spear, the posture beside the fire. What kind of memory is built not in words but in bones, in a way? This was the true beginning of their training. Not formal, not named, but relentless. And it was not only training of the hands, it was training of the nervous system, of fear response, of endurance, of social awareness. The boy who survived infancy stepped into a second crucible, the apprenticeship of silence, a world in which survival meant listening, observing, adapting, long before understanding. His body was still growing, yes, but his place in the system had already begun to solidify. In the glances exchanged between men, in the unspoken expectations, in the first moment an adult handed him something sharp. What happens to a mind shaped by vigilance before it knows safety? What kind of man is made when survival is not just a moment, but a method, repeated every day from the first breath onward? He becomes a system within a system, a pattern that reinforces itself, generation after generation. Each surviving male carries not only his own weight, but the invisible legacy of those who did not make it, the brothers who failed to thrive, the cousins buried in snow, the unnamed infants whose absence changed the trajectory of group life. And slowly, across centuries and continents, that burden of loss begins to write itself into the body. Into how boys grow, into how their skin thickens, how their bones fuse faster, how their energy is routed toward reaction rather than reflection. Not because they were destined to be hard, but because the world they inherited gave them no other choice. Paleoanthropologists studying Ice Age remains have observed peculiar trends in male development. Skeletons show signs of accelerated ossification in key joints, suggesting that movement, running, lifting, bracing, began earlier than we might expect, and yet these same remains often show stunted growth later in adolescence. A boy who started strong but never reached full adult height. Why? The answer lies, perhaps, in the balance between urgency and resource. When survival demands immediate function, the body prioritizes early strength over long-term potential. This is the biology of urgency, the architecture of a body built not to flourish, but to function in crisis. And it was not only the individual that adapted. The group did too. Roles began to solidify. Expectations narrowed. Even as boys played, if they played, their games carried undertones of readiness, stick throwing, rock balancing, target watching. These were not pastimes, they were prefigurations, and the boys knew, not intellectually perhaps, but viscerally. They knew what the adult world required, and that knowledge entered them through skin and breath and repetition. In some rare sites, like the Magdalenian layers of the Grotte des Enfants in France, archaeologists have found burials of children with carefully placed grave goods, pendants, beads, small tools. Among these, some belong to boys no older than 10. Their ornamentation suggests a kind of status, not earned through labour, but granted through identity. Was this the beginning of gendered expectation? Of a social script too old to name, yet persistent even now? To be male in the Ice Age was not to be dominant. It was to be watched. To be prepared, to be called upon before one was ready. And perhaps that is the quiet origin of so much that came later. The stoicism, the silence, the myth of toughness. Not born from strength, but from necessity. Not taught, but absorbed. Not glorious, but functional. What kind of society is built when half its sons are too fragile to survive, and the ones who do are shaped by that very fragility? Perhaps one that does not glorify strength, but recognizes endurance as its own form of wisdom. Not the endurance of triumph, but of repetition, of lifting again, walking farther, keeping still when everything inside demands movement. In the landscape of the Ice Age, survival was not a moment of brilliance. It was a pattern. It was adherence to rhythm, seasonal, bodily, social. And for boys who lived, that rhythm began early. Not with initiation, but with observation. Not with permission, but with expectation. Their test was not a ritual. It was a life, and the shaping continued. By the time a boy neared adolescence, his body bore the fingerprints of his survival. Thin enamel lines on teeth told of periods of starvation. Healed fractures spoke of accidents that did not kill. Knee joints worn from kneeling. Vertebrae compressed from early load-bearing. These were not symbolic markings. They were records, autobiographies in calcium. Across regions and millennia, the same story repeated itself. Boys pushed into adult function while their minds were still elastic. And in that stretch, something evolved. Not just in the flesh, but in the culture surrounding it. Because the group, too, needed these boys. In a band of 20 or 30, every pair of hands mattered, every set of eyes. The sooner a boy could contribute, even in small ways, the greater the chance the group had to endure. Stirring the fire, sharpening tools, holding the edge of a hide as it was scraped clean. These gestures were not just practice, they were participation. They were survival made social. And yet, through it all, a paradox remains. If boys were so costly to raise, why did they persist? Why didn't evolution favour only the fittest, the fastest, the fewest? The answer, buried in genetics, may be that selection acted not only on the child, but on the system that raised him. In groups where cooperative caregiving emerged, where the loss of a mother did not spell doom, where fathers and brothers and others filled in the gaps, boys survived in higher numbers. And so survival shaped not just the individual male, but the very fabric of how human groups functioned. The price of keeping sons alive may have been the birth of empathy. To trace the lineage of Ice Age men is not to follow the path of warriors, but of survivors. Not heroes in the modern sense, but vessels of continuity, shaped by risk, carried by others, and slowly hardened by time. Their journey began in vulnerability, in cries muffled by snow, in small fires lit against the dark, in the arms of mothers too tired to speak. And so the shape of a man began with what nearly broke him. His life was not owed, it was earned. One breath at a time, one trial at a time, one winter at a time. And then came the next trial, not of survival, but of learning. Because the boy who lived would not be spared from what lay ahead. The world he entered did not slow down to teach. There were no explanations, no rehearsals, no careful instructors crouching to his level. Everything was movement, everything was watching, and in this world to learn was to risk, to mimic was to bleed. Knowledge came not in lessons, but in bruises, in cold fingers, in misjudged leaps, and always in silence. Across nearly every foraging society studied in the modern world, from the Hadza of East Africa to the Inuit of the far north, the same pattern appears. Boys are not taught through direct instruction. They are expected to observe, to hover near the margins of adult activity, to pick up tools not because someone hands them over, but because they are left nearby, within reach, but not in invitation. This absence of formal teaching is not neglect. It is a system built for autonomy, for resilience, for adaptation. And in the deep past, it meant that every moment a child was near his elders, he was training. Not through words, but through proximity. Imagine the camp. Fire flickering, hides drying, stone being struck to flint. The boy crouches nearby, saying nothing. His hands mimic what he sees. He snaps a twig, trying to feel what pressure is needed. He watches where the elder places his fingers, how the wrist turns, and if he errs, if the stone slips or the edge bites, there is no scolding, only blood, and the lesson burned into skin. This was how Ice Age boys were apprenticed, not in skill, but in danger, not in safety, but in the very things that could hurt them. And still, they watched. The risk itself was part of the curriculum. To throw a spear too soon was to watch it tumble, clumsy and wide. To follow too closely on a trail meant the sharp bark of warning, or worse, the crack of a branch and a lost step. They learned where others stumbled. They absorbed danger as normal, and slowly what had once been instinct became intention. This was not play, not truly, though it may have looked like it. Games of chase, mock battles, the throwing of stones at unseen targets. These were rituals of rehearsal. Every action carried the seed of something real, of something that would one day draw blood, or protect the group, or cost a life. The line between play and preparation was not drawn in the sand, it was etched in the body. And so, by the time an Ice Age boy reached his 9th or 10th year, he had already lived a lifetime of watching, failing, and recalibrating. He had begun to build a map of danger, one felt in muscle memory and hesitation, not in speech. But a map is only as useful as the terrain it prepares you for, and in the Ice Age the terrain was never still. Weather shifted without warning, prey moved through silence and vanished across days, even the ground cracked and reshaped under melt and freeze. A boy's apprenticeship, then, was not toward mastery, it was toward improvisation, toward readiness, toward nerve. And that meant encountering risk not in theory, but in flesh. First wounds were not accidents. They were curriculum. They were how the body learned what the mind could not yet describe. The archaeological record bears the scars. Juvenile skeletons from sites like Sunghir and Tafaralt show small fractures in wrists, healed breaks in ribs, and cuts along finger bones, all markers of early trial, of misuse, of overreach. And while no inscription tells us what each boy was doing, the pattern is unmistakable. Hands injured in tool work, knees marked by falls, teeth chipped from raw bones or collisions. These were not fatal, but they were formative. Each scar was a thread in the web of adaptation, a message carried inward. This is too sharp. That edge gives. This noise means threat. And deeper than the skin, something else was taking shape. A nervous system wired not to avoid fear, but to metabolize it. To sit near fire and hear the howl of something close. To stay still while others fled. To lift a sharpened point and understand that it may not land where it is thrown. What does it mean to learn danger not as an emergency, but as a fact of the world? Not something rare, but something constant. Something to be expected, lived with, folded into routine. In this way, the Ice Age boy did not learn as a student, but as a shadow. He crept behind those who knew. He repeated motions until they bled. He failed quietly and often. But every failure refined the edge of his awareness. The world became a language he could not yet speak, but whose grammar he began to feel. Every movement of an elder's shoulder, every stillness in a grove, every tightening of breath when a scent crossed the wind. These were clues. This was how boys learned to live inside a system of risk, not above it, not beside it, but within it. And what kind of mind does that produce? A mind that cannot rest until it knows where every danger waits. A mind attuned not to what is safe, but to what is almost too much. Perhaps this is the legacy etched into the oldest rhythms of masculinity. Not bravado, not power, but calibration. Boys trained in danger do not grow into conquerors. They grow into listeners, watchers, carriers of quiet instincts that once kept fire burning through nights no one remembers. And those instincts were never purely physical. Survival demanded more than agility or strength. It demanded a kind of inner rehearsal, a psychological tuning toward the unpredictable. The boy who would one day hunt needed to understand more than tracks and shadows. He needed to prepare for failure, for waiting, for the sight of a wounded animal not dying fast enough, for the silence after a companion fell, for the split second in which violence was not a possibility, but a requirement. How does a child come to hold that truth without breaking? Through play, perhaps, but not play as we know it. What looks like play among forager children is often a scaffold for fear. Games that simulate chase, mock battle, stalking, ambush. Not just joy, but rehearsal. And in those rehearsals, boys begin to touch the outlines of consequence. In modern hunter-gatherer groups like the San and the Agta, researchers have observed how boys' play skews toward risk. Climbing, testing edges, throwing projectiles, navigating tension. These patterns are not meaningless. They are cognitive sculptors. They build familiarity with danger not as panic, but as process. And beneath that process lies something even deeper, an emotional transformation. Because fear cannot be erased, but it can be shaped. It can be folded into readiness. The boy who flinches too early might miss his chance. The one who flinches too late may not get another. And so, over time, boys trained in danger become boys who delay reaction, who wait a fraction longer, who breathe through the spike of panic and act anyway. This is not fearlessness. It is intimacy with fear. It is knowing its voice well enough not to mistake it for truth. Somewhere in a snowy forest, tens of thousands of years ago, a boy might have crouched behind a low stone, watching the silhouette of his father raise a spear, his pulse roaring, his breath short. But he does not move. He watches. He waits. He learns. That is how it was passed down, not through instruction, but through exposure, through the slow, calibrated shaping of nerves to match the pulse of a world that did not forgive missteps. And so it was that danger became familiar, not safe, but known, not avoidable, but woven into the fabric of life, like the cold, like hunger, like fire. It was there when a boy reached for a blade. It was there when he followed a footprint into dark brush. It was there when he met another boy's eyes and saw, mirrored there, the same fragile knowledge: this will not be easy, but I will keep going. How many boys learned the shape of their own courage long before they learned their names? And how many lost it before they ever had a chance to use it? Because not all who trained in danger endured it. The cost of this education was not abstract. In grave after grave, we find the remains of children who never reached adulthood, boys who played too close to the fire, who wandered too far into snow, who lifted tools before their hands could hold them. Their stories end before they begin, but they are part of the pattern. Their absence is part of the learning. Their deaths are the dark mirror in which the survivors saw themselves reflected. What does it mean to grow up beside the constant possibility of loss? To know, even without language, that others like you have fallen, that the same path you walk has taken lives only steps ahead. Perhaps it teaches more than skill. Perhaps it teaches perspective, humility, a kind of psychic vigilance that grows not from fear, but from proximity to it. This was the invisible curriculum of Ice Age apprenticeship. Danger not only as a threat, but as a teacher. And like all teachers, it left marks, not always on the skin, sometimes in posture, in the way boys stood, in the way they watched others before speaking, in the way their bodies tensed at certain sounds, a posture of readiness, of acceptance, of knowing deeply that safety was not a state of being, but a moment, and one that would always pass. What kind of mind is shaped by the knowledge that nothing is guaranteed? Anthropologists call this anticipatory socialization, the early absorption of roles not yet occupied. Ice Age boys practiced dying before they practiced speaking. They learned to carry weight before they knew what it meant to lead. And by the time they were old enough to be called anything at all, they had already internalized the rules of a world that demanded alertness, quick recovery and emotional restraint, a world where injury was expected and fear was private. Even the act of watching could be dangerous, to stand too close, to be mistaken for prey, to make a noise at the wrong time. The margin between apprentice and liability was razor thin, and so boys learned to vanish in plain sight, to shadow their fathers without slowing them down, to memorize what the elders never said out loud, where the traps were laid, how the wind moved around a rock, what the silence of birds might mean. And when night came, it was not always stories that were told. Sometimes it was only the crackle of flame and the whisper of breath. Sometimes no one spoke at all, and in that silence, danger was not gone. It was resting, waiting, reminding every child near the fire that one day, too soon, they would have to walk out beyond its light and meet it alone. And that, in the end, was the final stage of apprenticeship. Not mastery, not success, but solitude. The moment when a boy crossed the boundary between learning and doing. When the presence of an elder no longer buffered the danger, but instead became a memory, a shadow behind him. And what guided him then? Not confidence, not certainty, but repetition. The rhythm of movements burned into muscle, the echo of warnings never spoken, the flicker of every near failure that had not killed him. And a sense, not always conscious, that he had been shaped for this. Because danger, in the Ice Age, was not an episode. It was the air. It was the water. It was the bone-deep awareness that life was thin, and survival was a skill sharpened only by living close to the edge of what one could bear. This was the paradox of early learning, that by the time a boy was old enough to choose, he had already become the product of 1,000 choices made for him, by the cold, by the hunger, by the people who did not explain but only moved forward. And yet, in the very heart of this harshness, something else survived, something delicate. A kind of attention, the ability to read the land, the animals, the gestures of others, an empathy not born from gentleness, but from risk. Because to move safely through a dangerous world, one must constantly anticipate the needs and intentions of everything nearby. And so, without ever calling it by name, boys became observers of emotion, of posture, of breath. Their survival depended on reading others, not just prey, but people. The flicker of doubt in a companion's stance, the moment a father's voice held too much tension. These things mattered. These things taught. And what does that leave behind? In the bones, almost nothing. The archaeological record remembers wounds, yes, but not hesitation. It remembers fractures, but not fear. It remembers what touched the body, not what shaped the mind. And yet, the mind was shaped all the same. In the quiet hours before dawn, in the spaces between footsteps, in the long, slow years of becoming. To be an Ice Age boy was to apprentice in the dark, to be tested not by one trial, but by 1,000 small ones. Not by a ritual, but by a rhythm, and the outcome was never guaranteed. Many did not make it, but those who did, they emerged not as warriors, but as witnesses, carriers of an ancient vigilance that needed no words. So when we speak of Ice Age men, of their strength, their silence, their resilience, we must begin here, with the boys who learned danger before they knew safety, who were shaped not by victory, but by proximity to loss, who watched closely, failed often, and survived long enough to do it all again. And when those boys grew, they did not become statues of power. They became instruments of endurance. Their bodies, like their minds, were not designed for dominance. They were carved for function, not beauty, not symmetry, not display, just use. The male form in the Ice Age was a tool, a structure of meat and sinew, grown to move, to haul, to strike, to bleed, and to keep going. What we now call sexual dimorphism, the visible differences between male and female bodies, was not a flourish of evolution. It was the cost of a life spent closer to risk. In every foraging culture, certain tasks lean toward the male body. Not because of cultural fiat, but because of mass, leverage, thermoregulation, a thicker upper body, a broader shoulder span, denser muscle fibre. These were not ornaments, they were adaptations, forged in cold, in scarcity, in the long, slow pressure of doing hard things repeatedly until the body responded. In bone beds and burial pits across Eurasia, this truth is whispered through patterns of wear. Male femurs thicker, twisted by long-distance walking under load. Shoulder joints scored with micro-fractures from repeated spear throws. Elbows roughened by decades of grinding hide, shaping stone, skinning carcasses too large to lift. These are not wounds of battle, they are the signatures of use, and the shaping began early. From childhood, boys carried things, lifted what was too heavy, dragged hides too wide for their limbs. They bent before their backs had hardened, and by the time they reached 20, their spines already bore the quiet evidence of compression. This is not the body of a conqueror. This is the body of a cart, of a bridge, of a lever used too many times and still in use. What does it mean when the body becomes a vessel for labour, not for expression? When each cell is spent toward the fulfilment of a task, not the pursuit of self. There is a quiet nobility in that, perhaps, but also a cost. Because function does not preserve. It consumes. Every movement of a joint shaves away cartilage. Every step into frozen mud shortens a tendon's lifespan. Every lifted stone steals a little warmth from the future. The Ice Age did not reward strength. It demanded its sacrifice. And in the sacrifice it sculpted men who did not look like myths. They looked like tools that had not yet broken, but would, soon, and knew it. The body, then, was never a monument. It was a compromise, a negotiation between what the world demanded and what flesh could afford. Male bodies, in particular, became experiments in tolerances. How much load could a joint absorb before it collapsed? How long could muscles remain thick while food was scarce? How quickly could blood warm fingers numbed by wind that stripped skin from bone? These were not theoretical questions. They were answered every day, not in words, but in survival, or its absence. In Ice Age climates, cold was not just an ambient threat. It was a force that sculpted bodies from the inside out. Men carried more lean mass, and with it, more surface area. To keep warm, they had to move. Stillness was a sentence, and so, Evolution selected for engines, bodies that converted fuel into heat through labour. But this came at a cost. More mass meant more food meant more risk meant more death. And so, the male form became a paradox. Strong, but costly. Durable, but draining. Essential, but expendable. Even in skeletal remains. The story is clear. At sites like Dolni Vestonice and Przedmosti, male skeletons often show larger frames, broader shoulders, and more pronounced muscular attachments, but they also reveal earlier degenerative changes: compressed vertebrae, eroded hip sockets, bone spurs along the knees. These are not signs of aging, these are signs of usage, of a life where function eclipsed longevity. What kind of world moulds men to be strongest at the very moment they begin to break? And it wasn't just the work, it was the weight of temperature. To move through a glacial plain in winter meant facing an environment that clawed heat from the body faster than it could be made. Men wrapped themselves in hides, yes, but even that was not enough. The cold seeped through. It punished extremities. It dulled nerves and slowed reflexes. So the male body adjusted over millennia. Circulation patterns shifted. Subcutaneous fat decreased to allow faster heat distribution from muscle to skin. Hands grew broader. Faces became more robust. Noses longer to warm air before it reached the lungs. But adaptation is not perfection. It is trade-off. To be efficient in the cold meant being vulnerable to famine. To generate more heat meant needing more fuel. And when fuel ran out, the very engine that kept them alive began to cannibalize itself. Muscle wasting, joint stiffness, slowed cognition. In a body built to move, starvation arrived quickly. This was the knife edge of survival. To endure, they had to stay strong. But to stay strong, they had to keep eating. And to eat, they had to risk everything. What kind of strength is that? Not the kind carved into marble, not the kind told in songs. It is a strength made of friction and frostbite. A strength that disappears the moment it is no longer fed. A strength that knows it is running out and keeps going anyway. Because in the Ice Age there was no other option. To stop moving was to die. To conserve was to fall behind. And so, the male body became a rhythm of loss disguised as function. Even at rest it burned more. Even in sleep it demanded recovery. Muscles rebuilt themselves in fragments, ligaments frayed and stiffened. By the time a man reached his 30s, if he reached them, his body had already paid for every step, every lift, every sprint toward vanishing prey. There was no softness in that timeline, only momentum. And eventually its absence. Archaeologists studying Paleolithic remains rarely find pristine male skeletons. What they find instead are patchworks, bones that healed imperfectly, teeth worn down from sinew and grit, fractures that were never set, just used differently afterward. These were not exceptions. They were the norm. A man who had not been injured was a man who had not lived long, or who had not done enough to be missed. The price of usefulness was damage, and the body bore that damage in silence. There are no journals from the Ice Age, no confessions of pain, only clues, in calcium, in erosion, in the way one side of a pelvis wore faster than the other. Men adapted their movement to accommodate injury. They limped through the final years of their usefulness. They became asymmetric, one shoulder stronger, one knee stiff, one hand calloused in a pattern that spoke of a favouring, a memory of something that once broke and never quite returned. What happens to a sense of self when the body is always declining, even in its prime, when strength is not an arc but a slope, steep at first, then slowly eroding under the weight of necessity? Perhaps it builds a kind of humility. Or perhaps it builds something harder to name, a refusal to expect ease, a tolerance for discomfort so deep that it becomes invisible. The pain was not separate from their life, it was part of it, as natural as cold wind or hunger, as expected as dusk. But even as the body broke down, it remained in motion, because usefulness did not end with the first injury. In some cases, it did not even end with disability. Sites like Shanidar cave in Iraq show evidence of individuals, likely male, who survived years with profound impairments, missing limbs, crushed skulls, healed fractures that suggest others helped them survive, fed them. protected them. These were not discarded tools. They were bodies still honoured, perhaps not for what they could do, but for what they had already endured. And so we see another function of the flesh, not just movement, not just strength, but memory, a visible, walking archive of effort, of contribution, of sacrifice. The body became a kind of ledger, each scar a record, each limp a citation, each worn joint a sentence in the long, unwritten story of endurance. What kind of man carries history in the way he walks? One who understands that the past is not just behind him, but within him, fused into the angles of bone, the stiffness in the spine, the heaviness in the breath. In Ice Age societies, there was no clean division between youth and age, between peak and decline. There was only a long arc of use, shaped by the tasks that needed doing. Even as performance waned, a man's knowledge deepened. His worn body became a signal, not of weakness, but of experience. He had thrown many spears, missed some, buried others. He had seen the trail when it was almost invisible. He had learned which wood splintered in frost, which stones shattered under pressure. These were not lessons taught in words. They were transmitted by watching how he moved, how he stopped, where his eyes landed. In this way, the male body was not only a tool, it was also a text, a language others could read. Children learned how to move not just from the young and uninjured, but from the older and scarred, those whose bodies taught the consequences of error. To see a man wince as he knelt or wrap his hand a certain way around a tool was to receive an education no one intended to give. In pain, there was transmission, and that pain was not episodic, it was chronic, continuous. Ice Age men lived with inflammation as a constant companion, joints swollen from overuse, tendons rubbed raw by friction and repetition. There were no poultices, no anti-inflammatories, no long recoveries. Rest was a luxury the land did not offer. If you could move, you moved. If you could carry, you carried. If you could not, you stayed, or you were left behind. But even in that harsh equation, there was sometimes room for mercy. What does it say about a people when they allow the broken to remain among them? When they feed those who can no longer gather, warm those who can no longer walk, protect those who can no longer run? Perhaps it means they understood that strength was not just in muscle. It was also in memory, in cohesion, in the ability to absorb loss without becoming weaker. Men who could no longer chase mammoth could still shape stone, could still whisper warnings, could still recognize patterns in the sky, or habits in prey, or changes in wind that others had not yet learned to feel. So the body remained useful even in decline. Not despite its wear, but because of it. It had earned its place. It had paid its cost. And in that cost, it had become something more than flesh. It had become a map, a warning, a witness. How many of those men knew they were fading, not in failure, but in function, and kept giving anyway? How many gave their final years not in grand acts, but in quiet, continual contribution, until the tool finally broke? And when it broke, when the body failed completely, when the knees gave out, the shoulders froze, the grip loosened beyond repair, what remained? Not legacy in the way we speak of it now. No monuments, no names, only the memory of presence, the memory of movement, and in rare cases the bones themselves, laid into earth with stone tools beside them, or ochre brushed across the skin, or antler pendants pressed into the hollow of a chest. A gesture of recognition, of respect, perhaps even of gratitude. This man was used. This man was spent. This man endured. The archaeological record rarely shouts, but it whispers. In certain burials we find males placed with care, even when their bodies show clear signs of long-term damage, healed injuries, degenerative disease, teeth worn flat from overuse. These are not the graves of kings. They are the graves of men who worked, men who were, for a time, essential, and in being essential, were loved. Because when the male body was treated as a tool, its breaking was not seen as failure. It was seen as completion, and still, even in their final forms, these bodies told us something more. They told us that the human machine was never meant to last long. Life expectancy among Ice Age males likely hovered somewhere in the 30s, sometimes less. Few made it to what we would now call old age. Those who did carried visible signs of strain, bent backs, worn teeth, sclerotic joints. They had outrun the clock, but only just. Their survival was not a triumph of biology. It was a triumph of patience, of repetition, of pain endured without pause. What is the measure of a life lived under those conditions? Not wealth, not status, but usefulness, relevance, the ability to contribute, to carry, to fetch, to remember. And in that contribution, something deeper, a sense of embeddedness. The male body was not separate from the world it moved through. It was shaped by it. Weather etched lines into the face. Terrain carved grooves into the feet. Cold tightened the skin, dried the joints, slowed the breath. There was no illusion of control. The body was not a master, it was a servant. And yet, for all its erosion, it achieved something remarkable. It lasted long enough to pass the fire, to pass the tools, to pass the rhythm of survival from one generation to the next. That was the purpose. That was the point. The body as courier, the body as container. The body as momentary bridge between what had been and what still might be. So when we look at Ice Age men, at their worn spines, their broken fingers, their silent teeth, we are not seeing victims. We are seeing vessels, not made for glory, made for work, made for wear. Flesh, yes, but shaped as a tool and used completely. Then that tool was sent into danger, not occasionally, not reluctantly, but routinely. The Ice Age hunt was not an event. It was a cycle, a ritual of risk, a wager where the stakes were not just meat, but meaning. For men, to provide food was to secure not only calories, but identity. Reputation, place. And this meant the cost of failure reached far beyond the stomach. It touched the soul. To return empty-handed was not just disappointing, it was destabilizing. The group watched. The children noticed. The elders remembered. And if failure happened again, and again, something shifted. The man faded. Not in presence, but in relevance. Hunting during the Paleolithic was almost always a losing game. The success rate, based on ethnographic parallels and kill site analysis, was abysmal. Many attempts ended in nothing. Some ended in injury. A few ended in death. And yet it remained central, not despite the odds, but because of them. Because hunting tested what mattered. Patience, timing, strength, nerve, cooperation. A single bison might feed the group for a week. A failed throw might feed the vultures. The line between those outcomes was 1 second, one gust of wind, one misplaced footstep on a snowy slope, and that line bled. In male skeletons across the Ice Age world, we find the aftermath. Healed rib fractures, spear-tip lesions on the femur, teeth broken in blunt trauma, facial bones compressed from blunt force, defensive arm fractures, some from combat perhaps, but many from animals. From the front lines of the food chain, where the hunter was not always the predator, sometimes he was the prey. Sites like Dolni Vestonice, La Ferrassi, and even Shanidar tell stories in bone. Stories of men who met violence not in war but in work. Men who risked everything again and again because they had no other way to matter. And that word, matter, was not symbolic. In small-scale societies, the role of food provider determined status. Those who brought back meat gained social capital. The best cuts might be shared, but the memory of who delivered them lingered. Success meant prestige. Failure meant silence. And prestige was not pride. It was survival insurance. The admired were defended. The admired were included. The admired might fail once, even twice, and still be forgiven. But admiration had to be renewed. With each kill, with each return. The man was only as valuable as his last contribution. What kind of pressure does that carve into the spine? The hunt, then, was not an adventure. It was an ordeal, a test that never ended, a moving threshold that defined the edge of masculinity in a world where gender was not identity but obligation. Every hunt bled time. Every pursuit carried the risk of never coming back. And still, men stepped forward, again and again, into the snow, into the dark, into the long mouth of uncertainty. Because to stop was to vanish in another way, quietly, socially, permanently. In the Ice Age, disappearance did not always begin with death. It often began with exclusion. The man who could no longer contribute, who failed to bring meat, who slowed the group, who arrived after the kill was over, began to lose weight in the eyes of the group. Not because anyone said it aloud, but because absence speaks. A missed kill is remembered, a quiet fire is felt. And though Ice Age societies were cooperative, they were not endless in their patience. Every back had a limit. Every band had thresholds that could not be softened by kindness alone, and so survival status was not only physical, it was political, it was reputational, it was fragile. This made each hunt a performance, not just for food, but for visibility. Men moved with the weight of being seen. A well-placed throw was more than luck, it was identity reaffirmed. A man who fed the group could walk taller, speak louder, teach boys who had not yet proven themselves. But a man who failed often, who returned with empty hands and open wounds, grew quieter, his tools duller, his body heavier, not from fat but from friction, the slow drag of irrelevance. That drag appears in the bones, in men who lived long enough to show what accumulation looks like. In the density of their arm bones we find the echoes of spear throws. In the abnormal bone growths along the knees we find the echo of repeated crouching, sudden sprinting, impact and recoil. In the overdeveloped muscle attachments near the shoulders and spine, we find the pattern of a life lived hauling, lifting, reaching. And in the damaged joints we find the cost, the toll exacted not by one hunt, but by hundreds. The hunts that failed, the ones that ended in sprints, in falls, in being dragged, in being gored. In hiding in silence while something with breath hot and violent waited outside the thicket. Was it courage, or was it duty? Did these men hunt because they wanted to, or because they had to? The archaeological record cannot answer that, but the silence of the dead suggests a darker truth. There may not have been a choice. In an environment where meat was a lifeline and starvation was patient, men did what was required. And what was required often meant pain. Ethnographic records from recent foraging cultures show that male hunters often return home not triumphant, but exhausted. Their faces are drawn, their hands are raw. Their voices subdued. There is no song of victory, just a quiet sitting, a warming near the fire, a passing of meat to others before eating any themselves. Perhaps Ice Age men were the same, not heroes but bearers, bearers of wounds, bearers of silence, bearers of time, bleeding slowly through every pursuit. What does it mean to build a life around a task that demands so much and guarantees so little? Perhaps it means you begin to accept uncertainty as a condition of being, not a flaw in the system, but the system itself. For Ice Age men, the pursuit of prey was not only a confrontation with the animal, it was a confrontation with time. The hours walked, the days tracked, the seasons misjudged. A misstep in summer might mean a hungry autumn. A failed winter kill might end a bloodline. Every delay rippled outward, thinning fat reserves, dulling reflexes, fraying tempers, and so they walked, and waited, and moved, always chasing what might not appear, always gambling against the patience of cold and clan alike. Even success could be brutal. Bringing down a large animal, bison, elk, reindeer, or mammoth, was not a clean act. It was struggle. It was proximity to panic, to thrashing hooves, to tusks and weight and blood. Many injuries came not in the chase, but in the aftermath, in trying to finish the job, in holding the flank as it kicked, in stepping too close to a dying body that still remembered how to kill. And yet, they stepped in, again and again. Because the moment of danger was also the moment of worth. To have helped, to have taken the risk, to have bled, meant something, even if the wound was unseen. But wounds were seen. If not by all, then by some. The group watched. Boys learned. They saw who limped after the hunt, who winced beside the fire, who wrapped their wrists more often than others, and perhaps they whispered, not cruelly, but curiously. How many failures before he is no longer invited? How many slips before he stays behind? This too was part of the hunt, the invisible edge of status. Reputation was not declared, it was observed, and when it faded fast. That pressure could bend a man, not only in the bones but in the mind, the constant calibration, the balancing of risk and relevance. Too many failed hunts and a man might offer to stay behind, not out of laziness but shame, not out of fear but fatigue, because status was not protected by effort alone. It was measured in outcomes. What did you bring back? Who saw you do it? And what will they remember? In this way, the hunt was not only physical, it was social, psychological, symbolic. Every man stepped into it carrying not only his tools, but his story, recent failures, quiet victories, the silence after his last return. And when he ran, or threw, or bled, he did so under the weight of more than hunger. He did so under the weight of judgment, of memory, of the quiet calculus that asked again and again, will this be enough? What happens to a man who lives every day as if his worth is still undecided? Perhaps he sharpens his tools more than necessary. Perhaps he walks farther than the others, even when his knee aches. Perhaps he stops talking about the pain entirely. Because to name weakness is to risk becoming it. In a world where survival depends on contribution, there is no language yet for limits, only for what can still be carried, what can still be done. So he does it, even when it cuts, even when the cold creeps deeper than it should, even when he knows that this hunt might take more than it gives. The Ice Age rewarded movement, not rest. Men could not afford to recover for long. Every animal that moved on without them carried away calories the group might not replace, and so men stitched themselves back together quickly, with bindings, with silence, with the belief that tomorrow might offer more than today. But the landscape did not care for healing. The ground was hard, the wind was sharp, the prey was indifferent, and the body over time lost its willingness to rebound. One stumble became many, one failure became a reputation, and then came the moment no one spoke aloud, the moment the man was no longer taken seriously. What does that feel like? To know that others still speak to you but not with weight. To feel their eyes slide away when roles are assigned, when weapons are lifted, when danger is near. It is a kind of slow erasure, not of presence, but of importance. A man may still be part of the circle, but not at its centre. He has become peripheral. And in the Ice Age, the periphery was cold. Ethnographic parallels from forager societies today offer hints. Among some groups, when older men could no longer hunt, they turned to other forms of contribution, knowledge-sharing, storytelling, crafting tools. But that transition was not automatic. It required social permission. It required the group to still see value in those who could no longer chase. If that recognition was withheld, the decline accelerated, not just physically, but psychologically, because a body in pain can still endure. A spirit ignored begins to vanish, so perhaps men stretched themselves thin because they feared that disappearance more than death. Death was quick, disappearance was slow. It began with hesitation, with someone else being chosen to lead the track, with silence after a missed throw, with the ache that would not go away and the fire that no one asked you to tend. And so they kept running, kept lifting, kept risking. Not only for meat, but for memory, for a place in the story being written in every shared breath of winter. How many men bled not from failure, but from trying one more time to matter? How many carried wounds that had less to do with the animal and more to do with the eyes watching from behind? In Ice Age hunting, danger came in many forms, but the sharpest one was often invisible. It was not the antler, not the ice, not the fall. It was the constant calculation of worth. A man could survive a broken rib. He could survive a fever. He could survive losing a weapon in the snow. But to survive being forgotten, that required something deeper, something harder to define, a persistence not only of body but of narrative, a refusal to become background, to remain in motion, to keep walking forward even when no one asked you to. There were men like this. We know it because some of them were buried with care, not with grandeur, but with presence. A flint blade placed near the ribs, a hand posed gently over the chest. Perhaps he had not hunted for years. Perhaps his last kill was a long-remembered story retold by others, but he had mattered once, and that memory was enough. The act of burial itself, intentional, tender, tells us that his body was still seen, still honoured, still part of the story. But not all were buried. Many were not. Their bones lie scattered in open-air sites, gnawed, weathered, collapsed in positions that suggest sudden death far from camp. These too were hunters. These too bled time, but their end came quickly, and alone. Maybe they followed a wounded animal too far. Maybe they misjudged the ice. Maybe they simply fell behind, and the group, in silence, kept walking. Because survival has no space for prolonged goodbyes, this is the unspoken brutality of Ice Age masculinity. It was not built on dominance. It was not built on pride. It was built on use, on function, on what could be offered today, and that made it both powerful and brittle. Because no man, no matter how strong, could outrun failure forever. Every leg wears out, every eye dims, every throwing arm stiffens. And then comes the moment when even the best, even the admired, begin to vanish. Not all at once, but gradually, in missed opportunities, in others stepping forward first, in footsteps that no one tries to follow. Yet in that vanishing, something lingers. The pattern of their movement, the caution in their voice, the echo of their decisions embedded in the memories of younger men, those who had watched, who had walked behind them, who had seen not only the throws that struck, but the times they did not, and how the man stood up anyway. The Ice Age did not permit comfort. It permitted continuity. And through this brutal arithmetic of effort, injury and fading, men became part of something larger than their own strength. They became carriers of risk, of consequence, of culture. They hunted not just animals, but time itself. And when they failed, it was not always the end. Sometimes it was just the passing of the spear. And in that passing, another kind of survival began. Not in the field, but at the hearth. Not in speed or strength, but in steadiness. Fatherhood, in the Ice Age, was not loud. It did not declare itself. It moved quietly, like firelight across cave walls. When the hunt was over and the bodies were sore and the meat hung drying in the cold, men returned not only to rest, they returned to witness, to sit near the young, to mark the fire's rhythm with calm, to pass something on, even when they had no words for what it was. Fatherhood in deep time left no letters, no lullabies etched in stone, and yet the archaeological record offers hints. In some Paleolithic burials, children lie near adult males. Their ornaments match. Their ochre patterns echo one another. Whether by blood or bond, there is connection, and that connection mattered. In environments where infants were vulnerable, where children could vanish in the cold or vanish into hunger, care was not a luxury. It was a strategy, a slow, quiet form of survival. Ethnographic studies of modern foragers, from the Aka in Central Africa to the Agta in the Philippines, show patterns that may reach back tens of thousands of years. In these groups, fathers are not distant. They carry infants. They soothe crying. They share in warmth and watchfulness. And though the context has changed, the biology has not. Human males are unusually capable of long-term parental involvement. Hormones shift. Heart rates respond. The capacity is there, and under the right pressures, it emerges. In the Ice Age, the pressure was everywhere. Every winter tested the group. Every illness risked becoming fatal. Every absence left a gap. And so, men stayed. Not all the time. Not every man. But enough. Enough to leave impressions. To shape a child's earliest understanding of safety. To teach through gesture what could not yet be spoken. To take the flint scraper and show, without words, where to press, where not to press, and to let the child fail, but not alone. At night the fire revealed more than shadows. It revealed hierarchy, intimacy, continuity. The men who sat closest to the flames were not always the strongest. Sometimes they were the oldest, the fathers, the ones who had done enough, bled enough, brought back enough to earn stillness. And in that stillness they gave something else. Attention, memory, the beginning of culture. What kind of world is built when the strongest do not just protect but remain? When fatherhood becomes not an end but a second hunt, for warmth, for meaning, for legacy. Perhaps a world where memory deepens, where the child grows not only in the shadow of danger, but in the glow of presence. In that world, the fire becomes more than warmth, it becomes a gathering place for thought, for repetition. For stories shaped by scars. The old hunter, no longer swift, holds the gaze of the young with something else. Recall. He remembers the winter when the meat was late, the path the mammoths once used, the time the river iced too early and they had to sleep with stones inside their furs. These memories are not performance, they are preparation. And in that passing of knowledge, something shifts in the male role. It stretches beyond muscle. It becomes layered. The man is no longer only what he can bring back. He is what he can pass on, not just the flint blade, but the sense of when not to use it. The understanding of why a certain path leads to less game, though the tracks are fresh. The patience to wait when others would rush. These lessons cannot be carved into bone, but they are carried in posture, in pauses, in the way a man shapes silence beside the flames. The rise of intergenerational memory may be one of the most underestimated tools of Ice Age survival. With each child who remembered what the father knew, the group gained an extra layer of resilience. Mistakes did not have to be repeated, dangers could be predicted, and fathers, through their constancy, became keepers of that fragile thread, not by dominance, but by attention. The fire made this possible. Its light slowed the night. Its warmth held the group together. It gave men the space to speak, or not, and to be heard anyway. We often imagine Paleolithic fathers as peripheral, as distant, but this view collapses under closer scrutiny. In cooperative breeding models, supported by both anthropology and primatology, human children thrive not only because of maternal care, but because of extended support networks. Fathers included, especially in colder climates, where the margin of error was razor thin. Paternal presence was not optional. It was strategic, an extra pair of eyes. An extra set of arms, a steadying voice when the wind howled and the child shivered and the mother slept. This was not softness, it was structure. A structure built slowly, night after night, fire after fire, through cuts shared and hides stitched, through tools made together, through sleep guarded, and beneath that structure, a different kind of masculinity took root, not one of conquest, but of continuity. What does it mean to survive not by outrunning death, but by standing still long enough to help someone else live? Perhaps it means choosing to anchor when every instinct tells you to move. In a world carved by wind and claw, staying meant risk, but it also meant memory. It meant teaching a child how to hold the scraper without slicing skin, how to watch the way shadows fall across a snowy plain, how to listen to silence, not just for danger, but for absence. The absence of birds, of crackling ice, of something that should be there, and isn't. These were not lessons given all at once. They were dripped out in small acts, a correction of posture, a shared glance, a quiet grunt when the firewood stack was wrong. And through those slow transmissions, a kind of masculinity emerged that was not noisy. It was not about command. It was about presence, predictability. The man who always rose before the others, the one who stood by the cave entrance when the storm was loud, the one who said little but whose movements were constant. Children noticed, even infants, before speech, before understanding, knew the rhythm of the footsteps that meant safety. There is archaeological support for this rhythm. At sites like Pavlov, Sunghir, and Aren Candide, we find evidence of long-term social structures, of people returning to the same campsites across generations, of carefully prepared burials with shared grave goods. These patterns suggest more than survival. They suggest stability. And where there is stability, there are people who maintained it. Fathers who built hearths that others came back to. Men who were not just skilled, but dependable. In some cases, the objects buried with children mirror those used by adults. Smaller versions of tools, beads, or animal teeth. This is more than ornament, it is reflection. It suggests mentorship, a transmission of identity. And perhaps the man who once carried the real version of that tool sat nearby, watching the child cradle the smaller one. Not interfering, just watching. Ready, when needed, to adjust the grip. This is not a cinematic kind of strength. It leaves no epic marks, but it leaves impressions, slow, soft, and deep. And over time, these impressions shape the tribe more than any single kill ever could. They shape how fear is managed, how loss is grieved, how joy is shared. In a world where fire was survival, men who stayed close to it, who kept it alive, who taught others to. became more than hunters. They became memory bearers, timekeepers, a different kind of tool. It's easy to miss this when we focus only on bones and weapons, but in the flicker of torchlight in a deep cave, or the wear on a stone used not for killing but for carving, we can sense their presence. What kind of legacy is left when the sharpest thing a man passed down was not a spear, but steadiness? Maybe it is the kind of legacy that doesn't show up in trophies or scars, but in the way a group behaves under pressure. In how the children sit still when the wind shifts, in how a son binds a wound with quiet focus, in how a daughter stacks firewood in the pattern she saw a man repeat each winter. The survival of the Ice Age was not just in muscle and chase, it was in patterns, in rhythms that endured because someone embodied them long enough to be seen, imitated, and remembered. Fathers were not just role models, they were rituals. And rituals mattered. They gave shape to fear. They gave structure to night. In small bands without written language, without walls, without clocks, the presence of a calm adult male, returning, building, watching, became a kind of timekeeping. A boy could sense the season by the way his father layered the furs. A girl could predict a storm by how her father adjusted the firestones. These signals were not mystical. They were learned, stored in memory, and memory in this way became a form of insulation against panic, against chaos, against the unravelling that begins when no one knows what comes next. We see traces of this in wear patterns on tools, objects used not just for a few weeks, but for years, passed down or used alongside children, and in hearth sites that suggest repeated deliberate use, stones aligned not randomly but with intention. The fire was not just warmth, it was orientation, and the man who kept it burning through the long dark nights gave more than heat. He gave the group a centre. There are no statues of these men, no cave art showing them cradling infants or mending bindings. But perhaps that's the point. Their legacy was not made of spectacle, it was made of small things, moments too quiet for charcoal. A nod when a lesson was learned, a shared blanket, a hand resting lightly on a child's back guiding them through the snow. These acts don't fossilise, but their impact does, because the children who grew under that kind of care grew differently. They may have been no stronger, no faster, but they were steadier, more watchful, more able to become the next firekeeper, the next patient voice, the next man who chose to stay. And so the line continued, not because someone chased harder, but because someone sat longer, held longer, taught with their being. It is a strange kind of masculinity, in a world obsessed with power, one built not on control, but on repetition, one that survives not in song or symbol, but in what still flickers quietly behind the eyes of those who remember being kept warm. What kind of strength endures when no one is watching, and no one needs to? It may be the most lasting kind of all, the kind that doesn't demand a name, the kind that does not leave behind a monument, but becomes one. Built-in footsteps followed, habits inherited, fires lit by hands that never knew the first flame, but knew how to keep it alive. Ice Age fatherhood was not dramatic, it was devotional, not loud, but endlessly repeated. And through that repetition, something subtle took root. Resilience passed from presence, not performance. When we look to the fossil record, the focus is often on trauma, healed fractures, embedded points, wear, degeneration. But beneath those signs of suffering is a quieter story, one harder to measure, yet no less important. Some men lived long enough to raise more than one child, long enough to slow down and stay close, long enough to be buried not at the edge of a kill site but near others, in shared graves, sometimes oriented toward the hearth, sometimes curled beside a child. These are not stories of war. They are stories of witness, because surviving the Ice Age required more than endurance. It required transmission, of skills, yes, but also of stability. And the man who returned to the same place, the same child, the same fire, became a human constant in a world of shifting ice and sudden loss. His presence told others that the group still held, that danger had not broken the circle, that someone would still rise tomorrow and show how to prepare the sinew, how to scrape the hide, how to tend a wound with snow and patience. There is reason to believe that this kind of reliability became evolutionarily valuable. In forager cultures with high male parental investment, offspring survival improves. Childhood is long in our species, vulnerability is prolonged, and so a man who does not disappear after conception, who stays, teaches, tends, repeats, changes the equation. He makes the future more likely, not through dominance, through duration. That may be why, in our deepest myths, the firekeeper is so often a figure of quiet power. Not the warrior, not the trickster, but the one who waits, who knows the seasons, who teaches the others how to last. The father who carries no crown, but lights the torches that lead the way. These figures are not fantasy. They are memory, echoes of real men who in caves and forests and wind-blown plains chose to remain. And in doing so, they made it possible for others to go. For every man who hunted and risked, there was another who returned, not just once but always, who laid down the spear, took up the ember, and guarded the small breath of life that glowed through even the longest night. What if the greatest act of Ice Age strength was simply to stay? Then the second was this: not staying alone. In a world that punished solitude and made islands of the wounded, men learned to tether themselves to one another, not just by blood, but by rhythm, by risk, by repetition. The hunt did not begin with the throw. It began with the look across the frost, the nod that confirmed the plan, the trust that the man beside you would see what you missed and kill what you could not reach. Brotherhood, in the deep past, was not a sentiment. It was a survival pact, signed in breath and blisters. In many ancient sites the pattern is visible. Male skeletons buried side by side, often showing similar trauma, breaks in the same arm, healed ribs, crushed feet. These are not the scars of accidental life. They are the result of synchronized danger, of men who moved together, fell together, and returned, if at all, with each other's blood still drying on their hands. Archaeologists see the clues in places like Atapuerca, Dolni Vestonice and Sungir. Mail remains clustered, tools arranged for joint use, shared ornamentation like fox canines or ivory beads suggesting a kind of chosen kinship. These were not just hunting parties, they were survival agreements, emotional contracts forged in the absence of certainty, and these contracts mattered. In a land without maps or mercy, you needed more than skill to survive. You needed someone who would drag you out of the snow if your leg shattered during a stampede. Someone who would wait an extra hour for your breath to come back after the climb. Someone who would not leave you behind just because the mammoth turned and your arm failed. This was not idealism. It was calculus. The cost of abandonment was often higher than the cost of loyalty, but loyalty had to be learned. It did not come for free. Young men entered this world not with inherited bonds, but with the need to prove themselves, to earn their place within a web of trust already stretched thin. The lessons were hard, often wordless. Shared hunger, botched kills, nights of silence after failure. Yet out of this came a kind of unspoken alignment, a choreography of glances, signals, instincts tuned to each other's pace. When to charge, when to hold, when to feint, when to fall and trust someone would cover you. What held these groups together when everything, food, energy, warmth, conspired to pull them apart? What kept one man from hoarding the last scrap of marrow or letting a rival freeze beside the fire? The answer, perhaps, is not generosity. It is shared fate, a recognition that in the face of cold, teeth and time, no man truly walked alone for long. What does it take to trust someone with your death and your survival? Sometimes it takes nothing more than time. Time shared under tension. Time spent watching each other fail and get up again. Time inside a storm with the fire down to coals, and no one speaking, but no one leaving either. In that time, something hardens. Not affection exactly, but expectation. The knowledge that the man beside you has seen you shiver, seen you miss, seen you bleed, and still comes back the next morning with more flint, more wood, more space at the fire. This is not sentimentality. It is structure. It is the backbone of male cooperation. And like any structure under pressure, it had its breaking points. Not all brotherhoods held. The archaeological record tells of trauma not just from prey, but from other humans. Crushed skulls, defensive wounds, embedded weapons, many inflicted not by accident, but by hands that once shared the hunt. At sites like Jebel Sahaba, violence becomes a pattern. intra-group conflict, the slow corrosion of trust when resources run low, or hierarchies break down, or someone takes more than their turn. Male coalitions are powerful, but they are also volatile. They require constant maintenance, not through talk, but through gestures, through fairness, through recognition of effort, even when outcomes fail. Hierarchy emerged not as domination, but as coordination. The best groups were not led by the strongest, but by the most stable. The man who kept pace, who didn't panic, who adjusted, signalled, gave way when it mattered. Leadership was often invisible, not enforced from above, but absorbed laterally through respect. Ethnographic studies of forager bands today show that decision-making is often shared, diffuse, negotiated rather than commanded. Ice Age men likely moved the same way, forming ranks not by force, but by familiarity. You follow the one who brings you back alive, and within these moving temporary hierarchies, bonds formed that exceeded blood. Kin selection may explain some group cohesion, hunting with brothers, cousins, sons, but not all. At many sites, unrelated males are buried together, their tools intermingled, their ornaments matching. These are the traces of chosen alliances, of friendships forged by repetition, by proven reliability, by the shared experience of danger. The kind of relationships where no words are needed and where absence is noticed instantly, not because of loss, but because of imbalance. Yet even these bonds could fray. Survival applied pressure from all sides: hunger, fatigue, injury, fear, and in that pressure, cracks formed. The man who once pulled you from the river now looks at you with calculation. The group that once waited for you now walks ahead. Not because they hate you, because the ice is moving, and they must move too. Brotherhood, then, was not a guarantee. It was a negotiation, constant, unspoken, renewed with every step. What happens when the man beside you is both your shield and your competition? It means that trust becomes a balancing act, and every shared moment and every hunt, every watch, every meal is both a bond and a gamble. Because even in the most cooperative groups, resources remained limited. The mammoth could feed many, but not all. The warmth of the fire could not reach every sleeping body. The best stone blades were few, and so were the hides that didn't leak. In this narrow corridor of survival, male alliances became layered with unspoken calculus: who brings value, who lags behind, who stays calm, who falters. And over time, these calculations grew heavy. In some Ice Age campsites, we find spatial clues to these internal negotiations. Hearths clustered in tight circles, each with different tool types, as if representing smaller working units within a band. Bones processed differently, tasks distributed unevenly. Intra-group variation hints at subtle hierarchies, not enforced by violence, but by utility. The man who flinches during the hunt does not get first cut. The one who spotted the prey earns silence while he eats. These were not rules carved in stone. They were patterns, and like all patterns, they shifted when tested. Conflict resolution, then, was critical, not always with blows, but with boundaries. One man walks a little farther to gather wood. Another takes the uphill trail alone. Space was a form of de-escalation. Distance became diplomacy. And when disputes did break, they were often managed through the group's memory: who had helped before, who had faltered, who had remained consistent when others lost focus. In this way, reputation became currency, invisible but heavy. Yet reputation could not protect against everything. When fear overtook the group, when a lion's roar echoed too close, or the mammoth's charge trampled the front line, bonds broke, not always permanently, but enough to leave scars. The man you expected to cover your side flinched. The one who promised to wait vanished ahead, and even if you survived, the alliance did not. Trust was fragile. It had to be rebuilt, slowly, wordlessly, often without apology. Still, the need for one another remained. Ice Age men were not lone wolves. The myth of the isolated hero collapses under the weight of cold logic. A single man could not track, flank, kill, carry, butcher, and guard. He could not sleep safely. He could not hunt across vast plains without someone at his side. And so, even when bonds broke, they were often reforged, not because of sentiment, but because of necessity. The risk of solitude outweighed the wounds of betrayal. And so, a rhythm emerged. Trust, friction, distance, return, again and again, until cooperation itself became a kind of survival reflex. Not clean, not perfect, but durable. How do you keep walking beside a man who once left you behind, but who now holds your only blade? You do it because there is no other choice. And maybe, deep down, because he came back, because whatever fear or instinct made him flinch, it did not make him disappear. In the Ice Age, forgiveness was not a ceremony. It was a slow recalibration of breath and movement. A pause before passing the torch, a glance before rejoining the line. Survival made saints of no one, but it taught men to adapt, not only to the land, but to each other's limits. This emotional flexibility may be one of the most overlooked tools of Ice Age life. Just as men trained their bodies for cold and scarcity, they trained their minds for fluctuation, for failure, for the sharp disappointment of betrayal that doesn't break the bond, but reshapes it. These emotional alliances were not gentle, but they were elastic, and that elasticity helped groups hold. Evidence of this psychological resilience may be inferred, even if it leaves no mark in bone. In long-inhabited sites, like those at Kostenki or Mezhirich, the consistency of group reoccupation, tool standardization, and shared infrastructure suggests a kind of social memory. The same men or their sons returning to the same ground, trusting that whoever camped here before left it safe enough to come back to. This is not just planning, it is trust extended across time, and to trust time, you must trust people. Mutual care then did not mean affection, it meant shared investment. One man splinted another's leg not because he was kind, but because that man might be needed again, might save his son, might carry his kill next season. Every act of aid was a wager on future strength, and yet, in the doing, something else emerged. Empathy by repetition. Connection through effort, not born of feeling but of doing. You learn to care by carrying the weight together. Modern forager data supports this pattern. Among the Hadza, the Ache, the Kung, men cooperate not only because it's efficient but because it's expected. Peer surveillance, reputation, reciprocity. These values shape behaviour long before language can fully explain them. It's not about liking each other, it's about knowing you will need each other again. Still, not all men made it in. The ones who could not pace, who took more than they gave, who betrayed the rhythm or cracked under strain. These men fell behind. Sometimes pushed out, sometimes left behind by the silent logic of the group. Their stories rarely fossilise, but in the empty place by the hearth, in the unfinished spear shaft left on the cave floor, we see their outline. Absence too leaves a mark. So survival depended not just on strength, or even trust, but on endurance. The endurance to hold a fragile alliance together across cold, silence, and risk. What does it take to keep choosing the group, even after it wounds you? It takes memory, not just of pain, but of return, of the moments when someone did wait, when a body was carried, not left, when a kill was shared, even though hunger pressed in like a second winter. Brotherhood was never seamless, but it was enduring, and that endurance was carved not in speeches or vows, but in repetition, in the quiet recalibration after conflict, in the decision to walk beside the same man tomorrow, even if today he let the branch snap back in your face. Forgiveness, in the Ice Age, was a muscle, stretched by time, scarred by history, kept strong by need. And in that strange, weather-beaten fraternity, something emerged that was bigger than the individuals, a collective memory, a behavioural inheritance. Each man's endurance stitched into the rhythm of the group, into how they hunted, how they healed, how they responded to the cry of an injured ally, or the silence of someone too ashamed to speak. It became instinct, not because they were born with it, but because they practiced it, again and again until it became reflex. Some of this can still be read in the traces left behind. Hunting blinds built for two, kill sites with coordinated strikes, where patterns that show tools passed between hands rather than hoarded. And sometimes, even in the graves, shared burials of men the same age, interred with nearly identical gear, as if to say, these two were one rhythm, one pace, one arc. But even these rhythms were mortal. Brotherhood cracked under pressure. It always did. When winters stretched too long, when women were too few, when injury stole a man's strength and made him a burden. Then the contract grew thin, tolerance became tension, and what had once been a unit turned into friction. The line between ally and rival blurred. Still, the contract endured more often than it broke. Not because men were noble, but because the land was indifferent, and to walk it alone was a death sentence. The Brotherhood Pact, for all its fragility, was the closest thing to insurance the Ice Age could offer. No guarantees, only probability shaped by proximity, by shared effort, by time. So they walked together, sometimes in silence, sometimes through fury, sometimes with open wounds that never fully healed. And still they walked. Because survival did not reward the perfect, it rewarded the persistent, the ones who could fall out and fall back in, who could mistrust and then offer the flint anyway, who could feel the weight of disappointment and still carry the pack. Perhaps this is the shape of endurance no bone can show, not in the arms, but in the eyes. The look that says, I remember what you did, and I'm still here. What if the strongest bond in the Ice Age wasn't love, but the decision to return anyway? Then perhaps the deepest wounds were not in the body but in the space that followed after. Not in the cut of the fang or the break of the bone, but in the quiet. In the nights when someone did not return. In the places where a name was once spoken, now avoided. In the gestures that shifted because a rhythm had been broken, and no one knew how to restore it. Some wounds leave no blood, no fracture, no trace in calcium or collagen, yet they shape behaviour all the same. There are clues in the bones, not of grief itself, but of its weight. Skeletal signs of chronic stress, stunted growth, prolonged inflammation, markers of lives lived under a ceiling of constant threat. Endocrine disruption, cortisol patterns writ in porous bone. When boys grow into men in a world where loss is routine, the body keeps count. Healed injuries tell one kind of story, but halted growth, that is another. A record not of an event, but of a season. A life throttled by pressure no one could see or only endure. And still, men endured, again and again, because there was no other way forward, yet that endurance carried a cost. Not just in joints worn too early or fingers lost to frost, but in the narrowing of the inner world. Silence grew around pain. There was no word for what it felt like to hold a brother's cooling hand, or to return from the hunt alone, knowing someone had watched your failure. And so the silence thickened, not as weakness, but as structure, a necessary hush around things that could not be fixed. But silence is not absence. It is memory coiled tightly. It is language turned inward, carved into the face, the hands, the way a man sits too long at the edge of the fire. In some Ice Age dwellings, there are markings on bone and stone that seem to repeat, scratched spirals, rhythmic dots, the same line drawn again and again until it fades into the surface. Perhaps it was a tally, perhaps a prayer, or perhaps it was simply a shape to press into the silence, a place to put the ache. Grief leaves no footprint, but mourning does, and there are sites where the body of a man is buried not in haste, but with deliberation. Ochre on the brow, tools laid beside the hand, sometimes even ornaments placed on the chest, as if to say, he was more than useful, he was known, and now he is gone. What happens when a man has no place to put the pain, but still has to wake and walk? He learns to carry it differently, not like a wound, but like a tool, sharpened by repetition, blunted by time. In the absence of ritualized mourning, emotion becomes embedded in the body, in how one walks, where one sits, what one avoids. And yet there were rituals, in forms we still struggle to read, because they were not written in words or marked with monuments. They were small, fleeting. Grief made visible in the quiet offerings left in shallow graves, in the way bodies were positioned, not tossed but curled, often facing east, as if even death should begin again with light. At Dolni Vestonice in the Czech Republic, the body of a man was found laid out with care, flanked by mammoth bones dusted in ochre, and buried with a fox-tooth necklace. He was not young. He had lived long enough for his teeth to wear down, for his joints to harden. There are no signs of violence. But the grave speaks anyway. It says he mattered, that someone took the time, that even in the ice where time was rationed like food, this man was given presence, and that presence may have been a form of survival too, not for him, but for those who remained. In burying the dead with meaning, the living gave shape to absence. They anchored loss in ritual. In doing so, they kept it from dissolving everything. Grief that is named becomes bearable. Grief that is held, even briefly, does not have to be hidden. Still, most pain did not make it to the surface. It moved quietly through the body, carving new silences. In modern forager groups, men often express grief through distance, through long walks alone, through staring into fire without speaking. It's possible the men of the Ice Age did the same, retreating not out of weakness, but to preserve the group from their rupture. And then, when the silence grew too wide, they returned. Not healed, but ready. Some left marks instead, cave walls scratched with finger lines, bones carved with parallel grooves. In some sites, small figurines appear, shaped from ivory, clay, or stone. They rarely show faces. Sometimes they don't show anything human at all, but they repeat, again and again across centuries. Perhaps they were charms, or memories, or unspoken prayers, symbols to catch what could not be said. This is where masculinity hardened, not in the hunt, but in the aftermath, in the demand to hold grief without dropping the spear, to feel loss and still lift the child, to remember, but not collapse. What shape does sorrow take when you have no word for it, and no time to sit down? Sometimes it takes the shape of repetition, the same gesture, the same task, the same walk around the same perimeter, not because it must be done, but because it keeps something from breaking. Ice Age men, like many who live under long-term pressure, seem to have leaned into rhythm, not for efficiency, for survival of the self. The act of doing became a substitute for the act of feeling, and in that endless doing the pain found a place to settle. There are traces in the archaeological record that suggest behaviour structured around emotional endurance. The careful maintenance of hearths, repeated returns to the same camp despite changing conditions, the standardization of tool types even across generations. These are not just functional decisions, they are emotional anchors, ways to preserve a known world in the face of unrelenting change. And in that preservation, a man could keep grief from becoming madness. But sometimes it wasn't enough. There are sites where entire groups vanish from the record, places used for generations, then abandoned without clear cause. No fire residue, no burials, just silence. Perhaps the herd shifted, perhaps the climate turned, or perhaps a sickness came. A death too big to carry. In such moments, the group may have done the only thing left. They walked away, left the place, left the memory, started over somewhere else, not because they had the strength, but because they could not stay. Among modern foraging societies, men sometimes mark grief by removing themselves from ritual, stepping back, going quiet, refusing food. These behaviours are not weakness, they are signal. They say, I am not whole, but I'm still here. The Ice Age had no therapists, no shrines, but it had gestures, small, repeatable forms of expression that held emotion without unravelling the group. Some gestures became art. Simple etchings on bone, crosshatches on a spear shaft, handprints on cave walls, some of them male, painted in red or black, pressed again and again into stone. These marks were not declarations of strength, they were traces of presence. I was here, I endured, I saw. In the deepest parts of caves and far from firelight, far from audience, men left these prints, some alone, some in clusters, sometimes overlapping. Perhaps they returned to these places when the group slept, or when they couldn't. Not all silence is emptiness. Some is deliberate, some is sacred, and some is the last thing a man has left when everything else has gone. What if grief in the Ice Age was not spoken, but pressed, slowly, into the walls of the world? Then it becomes clear that survival was never just about food or fire. It was about meaning. The kind that keeps a man from going still inside. The kind that lets him hold a child's hand after burying a brother. The kind that makes the same path feel sacred, not hollow. And so men created patterns, in tools, in fire circles, in marks on stone. Not because they were beautiful, but because they were bearable. In the repetition, there was comfort. In the gesture, there was structure. These were not decorations, they were anchors. And they were needed, because even among the strongest, the silence could swell. In trauma studies today, we know that psychological wounds do not require explosions to form. Repeated exposure to danger, to loss, to helplessness, this accumulates. And though Ice Age men had no names for these things, they knew the symptoms. The man who stopped speaking, who startled too easily, who walked too far, who stood too close to the edge. Not all grief ended in ritual. Some ended in withdrawal, in long stares, in absences explained by weather, but not by will. And yet the group moved on. It had to. Because even when a man's inner world fractured, the outer world did not pause. The ice still advanced. The game still ran. The children still cried. There was no luxury of collapse, so the wounded learned to walk anyway. Perhaps that was their greatest strength, not to resist breaking, but to move, even after they broke. Evidence for this quiet persistence exists in the archaeological record. Skeletons showing signs of chronic pain, fused joints, deteriorated spines, yet buried with hunting tools, ornaments, or symbols of status. These men were not cast out. They were honoured, remembered. Someone carried them when they could not walk, or waited for them at the edge of the kill zone. This kind of care is not just logistical, it is emotional. It says, your body failed, but you still belong. And still, the emotional cost hung in the air, not spoken, but present, in the firelight, in the eyes that met and turned away, in the songs, if they sang, that changed when a man was gone. We cannot know the words, but we can feel the cadence, slower, lower, made to echo not just across valleys, but across absence. The Ice Age shaped bodies, but it carved minds too. It taught men to hold what could not be healed, and to pass on not just skills and songs, but silence, thick with everything they could not say. What does it mean to inherit pain and carry it forward like fire hidden beneath the ash? It means that survival became more than a contest of muscle or hunger. It became a quiet transmission of endurance, the passing down of grief, not as weakness, but as wisdom. Ice Age men did not leave behind journals or oaths, but they left traces in how they buried their dead, in how they returned to the same paths, in how they marked what could not be spoken. Each generation carried more than weapons. They carried memory, and sometimes memory hurt. But to remember was also to remain human. Without that, men would have become animals, reacting to death with indifference, moving past loss as if nothing had happened. That's not what the evidence shows. What we find instead are signs of effort, signs that men paused, that they acknowledged, that they built meaning, even when it cost them time or warmth or safety. The ochre, the beads, the shared fires in the dark, these were not necessities, they were declarations, that this mattered, that he mattered, that I matter still. And maybe this was the beginning of something larger, not just culture, but conscience. The slow rise of an inner world that could hold sorrow without breaking. That could absorb fear, loss, and failure, and still choose to go back out into the cold the next day. This was the forge of Ice Age masculinity, not shaped in triumph, but in tolerance, not in conquest, but in quiet continuation. Because the land did not stop hurting, it never promised comfort. And the only answer was to endure, again and again, while holding on to something sacred. Sometimes it was a name, sometimes a mark, sometimes the habit of silence passed from father to son. Sometimes it was the way a man placed a stone beside a grave every winter, without fail, without words. A ritual no one taught him, only remembered. And so, under the weight of cold and years, Ice Age men became keepers of both survival and sorrow. Their bones show strength, their tools show skill. But it is in the spaces between, in the gestures, in the fire patterns, in the quiet corners of painted caves, that their inner lives begin to speak. We will never know their thoughts, but we can feel the shape of their grief in the things they made, the things they carried, and the way they refused to forget. Perhaps the most enduring strength of Ice Age men was not that they could kill, but that they could feel and still continue. And so the fire stays lit, not just for warmth, but to hold the memory of those who no longer sit beside it. But even the fire could not promise safety, not when night fell across the steppe and the cold was joined by something older than memory, eyes in the dark, paws on snow, the low breath of something watching. In the Ice Age, sleep was never surrender. It was a risk. Every man who closed his eyes did so with the knowledge that he might not open them, not because of dream or illness, but because a lion might come before dawn. To survive that, men had to learn how to sleep carefully, strategically, in bands and circles, in places chosen not for comfort, but for protection. The mouths of caves were not just shelter, they were choke points, a way to narrow entry, to funnel threat. Many Ice Age dwellings, when found intact, show signs of internal segmentation. Fires in the centre, sleeping spaces arranged along the back or sides, bodies curled together, not just for warmth, but for surveillance. Even in unconsciousness, proximity mattered. Who you slept beside could mean the difference between life and death. Some groups chose rock shelters or shallow depressions instead of full caves. Why? Because caves could trap too. A predator entering might block the exit, so men weighed the risk. Chose sites where they could face out, where they could feel the night air shift, where one man could see while others slept. This was not luxury. It was architecture, survival architecture, shaped by necessity, not design. And still, the predators came. There are claw marks on the walls of some ancient shelters, saber-tooth incisions, bear scrapes, deep enough to be visible thousands of years later. In one site, the remains of a man and a cave lion were found intermingled. A final struggle, a night that did not go as planned. These were not rare events. Night was alive, and men were part of its rhythm. To protect the group, sentry roles likely rotated. This is seen today in forager cultures where nighttime vigilance is shared, and no single person sleeps through an entire night without interruption. The youngest might watch first, the older men last. Firewood had to be managed, embers kept glowing, ears tuned not just to growls but to silences, those sudden absences of sound that mean something is near. The men who stayed awake didn't just guard, they memorized the dark. And even for those who slept, it was never deep, not truly. Fear left a pulse in the spine, a twitch in the limb, a dream interrupted before it could begin. Sleep for Ice Age men was not rest. It was preparation, a ritual rehearsal for whatever came next. What does it mean to sleep when the dark itself is hungry? It means the night becomes a battlefield of awareness, not with weapons, but with breath. With the way a man lies half awake, listening past the crackle of fire, with how he positions his spear within reach, even as his eyes close, with the rhythm of shared sleep, not all at once, but staggered, so that at least one heart is beating faster, at least one set of lungs is pulling air with attention. Sleep was not trust, it was a strategy. The positioning of bodies was part of that strategy. Men often slept at the outer ring of the group, especially in colder regions where their bulk offered warmth to those within. But this was not just about temperature, it was about risk. If something approached, a hyena, a leopard, a bear, it would meet them first. This outer ring was the first line of defense, not just in battle, but in dreams. To sleep in that space was to accept the weight of vigilance, even in unconsciousness. Caves and shelters often show signs of layering. Bedding materials, piles of grass, hide impressions that suggest repeat use in specific formations. These were not random. Men slept in patterns, not as a luxury, but because patterns reduced chaos. Everyone knew who would be where, who would wake whom, who was closest to the spear pile, who would tend the fire if it dropped too low. Sleep became a choreography, passed down through habit and necessity. There are few direct records of sleep from prehistory, but clues remain. In fire residues spread thinly around sleeping spaces, a sign of embers kept low and long. In charcoal scatter that suggests men moved around the fire even during the night. In footprints found deep in caves, leading into darkness, then stopping, as if someone had walked far to dream in silence, or to wake in peace, or to never return. Among modern forager societies, some of the same behaviours persist. Among the Hadza, for instance, people rarely sleep through the night without stirring. Someone is always awake, not by order, but by instinct. It is a dance of attention, a human flame flickering, always lit. This may be one of the oldest forms of social defense, not the weapon, but the watch. And yet, fear was not the only force that shaped sleep. There was also bonding, the shared fire, the quiet murmur before rest, the rhythmic breathing that signalled safety, if only for a few hours. These small moments mattered. In a world that never stopped threatening, they gave shape to calm, gave the body a reason to loosen. Even in fear, men found ways to rest, not because the dark had changed, but because they had learned how to live inside it. How do you dream, when every shadow might be real? Perhaps you don't. Or perhaps your dreams take a different shape. Sharper, faster, fleeting. Not stories, but flashes. Fire, teeth, ice. The echo of a scream you've never made. In modern neuroscience, we understand that sleep, especially REM sleep, helps regulate fear, memory, and emotional intensity. But what happens when even sleep is broken? When a man must wake every hour to feed the fire or listen for footsteps, then dreaming becomes fragmented, not less real, just more raw. It's possible that Ice Age men dreamt in fragments too, and those fragments may have carried meaning, not just to the dreamer, but to the group. In many foraging societies today, dreams are not private events. They are shared in the morning, interpreted, sometimes acted upon, a warning, a sign, a decision delayed because a man saw blood in the snow behind his eyes. There's no reason to assume Ice Age people were different. They may have seen the dream world as an extension of the hunt, a place where messages pass through shadow and smoke. There are signs of this in the art they left behind. In the deep caves of Europe, images of bison, lions, owls, and men with animal heads cover the walls. Far from living spaces, in places that required long, dangerous travel in total darkness. These were not idle decorations. They were experiences, perhaps dream visions, perhaps memory maps of places or hunts that unfolded not in daylight but behind closed eyes. To crawl deep into a cave and paint by torchlight is not just devotion, it is ritual, maybe even healing, and healing was needed because the fear did not end at sunrise. A man who nearly died in the night did not forget it by noon. Trauma even then had to live somewhere, and if it wasn't spoken, if it wasn't safe to cry or shout or fall apart, then maybe it was dreamt instead. Not as catharsis, but as containment, a place to store the worst without letting it spill into the waking world. Some may have found clarity there, others torment, but either way, dreams offered a form of expression in a life where so much was constrained, where sleep was rationed and silence was law, and when the dreams became too sharp, when they cut instead of healed, perhaps the group knew. Perhaps they moved a man closer to the fire, gave him first watch, let him walk until dawn, if that's what he needed. In this way, the night became a second life, a parallel world of images, fears, and meanings, one that couldn't be hunted, only witnessed. What if dreams were not an escape from danger, but the oldest way to survive it? Then perhaps fire was not just light, but a way to hold the dream world open, a tether to the living, a signal that the group was still awake, even when some of its members were not. For Ice Age men, fire was never decorative. It was a perimeter, a presence, a spell against the unseen. And the way they kept it alive, low enough not to blind, high enough to keep the cold and wolves away, tells us how carefully they moved between worlds. Sleeping beside a fire meant sleeping beside memory. Each ember a reminder of who had tended it last, of who would rise next. Some men slept with sticks in hand, ready to stir coals without leaving their hides. Others slept light, with one eye on the shadows, and all of them knew the weight of failure. A fire that died before dawn was not just inconvenience, it was exposure, it was scent and silence. The very things predators used to slip in unseen, so they developed patterns, rules. Not written, but lived. Who slept first? Who watched? How often the wood was turned? Who faced the cave entrance? In the archaeological record, these habits live on only faintly, in hearth layers, in soot stains, in tools placed within reach of where bodies once lay. But the logic behind them remains clear. No one survived alone, not even in sleep. And when the system failed, the cost was permanent. Skeletons found with fang marks on the ribs, jawbones cracked, a camp abandoned mid-meal, never returned to. These were reminders that the dark was never empty, that a moment's rest could become a lifetime's end. And yet, they still slept. Not because it was safe, but because it was necessary. Fatigue was its own predator. Men who didn't sleep became slower, less alert, more likely to misstep, to miss a signal, to fail the group. So sleep was rationed carefully, protected fiercely, and honoured silently. There were no lullabies, but there were rituals. The way a man stretched out his hide, the way the others moved to make space. The unspoken agreement that if he closed his eyes, someone else would open theirs. Even among danger, there was trust, not of the world, but of each other. That was the only way to rest, to surrender breath for a few hours, knowing someone would stir if the wind shifted. That if a sound came too close, you would wake not to claws, but to a hand on your shoulder. What kind of man learns to sleep through fear, because he knows he is not the only one listening? The kind who understands that sleep itself is a form of trust, not in safety, but in system, in structure, in the rhythm of breath and responsibility passed between those still awake. Ice Age men were not fearless, they were simply practiced. Practiced in restraint, in rotation, in rituals that turned danger into something predictable. And within that predictability they carved out moments of rest, short, fragile, and never fully complete, but enough. Because sleep was never the absence of risk. It was the management of it. A fire placed just so. A body curled in a known position. A spear handle held like a child's toy beneath the chest. There were no locked doors, no walls to secure the edge, just flesh, bone, and attention, passed back and forth through a long and dangerous night. And still, even in such a world, there was grace, in the sound of someone breathing beside you, in the glow of embers reflecting on the cave wall, in the shared silence before the last man lay down and the one before him rose. These moments mattered. They were not just tactical, they were emotional. They reminded each man that he belonged, that if he closed his eyes he would not be left behind. Some nights were broken by screams, others by growls, by the sudden collapse of certainty, but most were not. Most passed quietly, uneventfully, and that too was survival, the quiet kind, the unnoticed kind that accumulates across generations. Every night slept through without attack was a gift to the future, a man who lived to tell his son how to listen to the wind, a pattern that held, a habit that saved. We don't know what their dreams held, but we know they kept dreaming, because they kept sleeping, despite it all, despite the threats, despite the things that crawled and stalked and circled, despite the memories. They found a way to lie down, close their eyes, and drift, however briefly, into another world. And from that world, they returned, again and again, to rise, to walk, to build, to keep watch for others, to survive. Perhaps that is what defines them most. Not their tools, not their muscles, but their willingness to rest in the open, with a world full of teeth just beyond the firelight. And so the fire stayed lit, not just for warmth, not just for light, but to hold the space where men dared to close their eyes and wake up still alive. Waking was not enough. Breathing was not the end of the story. In a landscape where snow could erase a trail in minutes, where bones dissolved into mud, and names were never spoken beyond 1 or 2 generations, survival was incomplete without remembrance. And so, Ice Age men carved. Not as artisans, not as artists in the modern sense, but as beings desperate to leave a trace, a contour, a line that said, I was here, I endured. Their marks are not always beautiful, some are jagged, some repetitive. Some so faint they vanish unless viewed in raking light. But they exist, on antler, on stone, on cave wall. They exist not for worship, but for identity. The flint-napped blade with a ridge pattern seen nowhere else. The bone spear point with notches along one edge, perhaps counting kills. The engraving of a mammoth with a human handprint beside it, not because the artist wished to be admired, but because he wished not to be forgotten. These were men who lived in anonymity, and yet they resisted it. They made tools that bore signature. They passed objects across time as if whispering through the sediment. We often assume prehistoric life was too brutal for ego, but perhaps what we call ego was, in their world, a form of resistance, against erasure, against the indifference of wind and ice. To carve the self into something harder than flesh was not vanity. It was survival of another kind. And in some places these carvings became language, a shared system of symbols. The V-shaped incisions found in multiple regions, the crosshatch marks near hearths, the totemic lines scratched into shelter walls, not decorative, but declarative. This is who we are. This is who was here. Some scholars attribute the more abstract carvings to male individuals, based on context, tools found beside adult male remains, engravings on hunting gear, or fire-aligned markings that suggest a ritual function. But beyond attribution lies intention. These were not casual doodles. They took time, effort, sharpness. In a world where every calorie mattered, spending energy on aesthetics meant the meaning was profound. A man who sat by firelight carving spirals into bone was not bored. He was anchoring himself, in memory, in matter. What drives a man to mark the world knowing it may never speak his name? What compels him to etch lines that no one might see? Perhaps it is the same impulse that drives us now to write, to speak, to build. Not just to exist, but to be known by someone someday, somehow, even if that someone arrives 40,000 years too late. Still, the gesture remains. A groove in the horn of a reindeer, a spiral buried beneath layers of soot, a row of notches along a spear shaft, uneven but deliberate. These were not made for gods or for glory. They were made because the alternative was silence. Ice Age men knew, even if they could not articulate it, that to survive as a body was only part of the task. To survive as a presence, to persist in the world after breath, that was the deeper work. So they carved, sometimes on the weapons they used, sometimes on the walls they passed, sometimes on the bones of animals they had killed. These marks were not just aesthetic, they were relational, between a man and his prey, between a father and the next user of his tool, between the self and the land that would bury him. The act of engraving became a kind of reply to danger, to forgetting, to the unyielding churn of seasons that erased almost everything. In some Ice Age sites we find repeated symbols, chevrons, crosses, abstract shapes that show up far from each other, carved on different materials by different hands. Were these clan marks, proto-signatures, a form of territory or memory or oath? We do not know. But the consistency suggests that identity, for some men, was not only personal, it was collective. To carve a symbol was not just to say I was here, it was to say we remain. This becomes clearer when we look at where these carvings appear, not just on tools but near hearths, on the inside walls of shelters, on the backs of pendants, unseen when worn. These were not performances, they were private inscriptions, messages to the future, to kin, or to no one, perhaps to the self. To inscribe a mark in such a place is not to display. It is to embed, to wrap the identity inside the object like breath inside bone. And still, there is no vanity in these things, no names, no portraits, no grand declarations of conquest, just marks, just patterns, repeated again and again across space and time, with the kind of quiet devotion that suggests not ambition, but longing. For what? Maybe only for the world to notice, to answer back, to remember that in the year of deep snow and the silence of the mammoth herds, someone sharpened a flint and made a line, and another, until the silence cracked just enough to echo. These echoes are what we hold now, in glass cases, in cave scans, in the stillness of museums. We do not know the names, but we know the hands, calloused, split, tired, yet still carving. What kind of man leaves behind a mark not to be seen, but so that he won't be lost? The kind of man who understands that survival is not only in the body, it is in transmission, in symbols passed from hand to hand, in the quiet inheritance of meaning. Many Ice Age men lived and died unnamed, but they did not vanish. Their carvings moved. Objects that bore their touch were carried, traded, buried, and sometimes brought back to the fire generations later. A bone with an old pattern might still hold value, even if its origin was forgotten. These artifacts became vessels of presence, not personal, but ancestral. The self, stretched across time. And this is where the line between tool and art begins to blur. A spear was not only a weapon, a carving was not only a flourish. In some cases, the very act of personalization may have made a tool more effective, not mechanically, but psychologically. A man who etched into his blade may have felt more bound to it, more focused in its use. In hostile environments, any edge, even symbolic, could matter. A decorated tool became not just an object, but a partner, a reminder of intent. This theory finds echoes in the ethnographic record. Among hunter-gatherers today, men often modify their gear with marks that serve no practical function, yet hold personal or spiritual meaning. A shape for luck, a line for lineage, a pattern known only to the maker. These markings are quiet reinforcements, ways of saying, I know this, I made this, I am part of this. The Ice Age was no different. A cold world demands connection, even if that connection must be carved into ivory instead of spoken aloud. And not all carvings were simple. Some show layering, revisions over time, new marks added to old ones. This suggests that memory itself was dynamic. Not a single event, but a palimpsest. A history built like a wall, one symbol at a time. These surfaces became maps of thought, a kind of autobiography without language. A journal kept in grooves. There are also examples of deliberate destruction. A carved object broken and buried, a marked surface scraped clean. Was this erasure, mourning, release? Whatever the cause, it shows that even absence was considered. That marks were not just made, but sometimes unmade. That Ice Age men did not only fear being forgotten, sometimes they needed to forget. And still, most of what we find remains intact. The persistence of these small gestures across millennia tells us something fundamental, that even amid starvation, danger, and cold, men found time to leave signs. They did not always need to be seen, only known, only held. Perhaps that is how identity survives, not in faces or names, but in the grooves we choose to leave behind. Some of those grooves weren't meant to be seen at all. They were hidden beneath other materials, burned, buried. Worn next to the skin until the lines faded. But fading did not mean failure. The act of carving, of deciding something deserved to be marked, was its own kind of permanence. In this way, Ice Age men practiced a form of survival that went beyond injury or hunger. They protected themselves in memory. Even if the world erased everything else, the gesture itself had weight. Some marks took the shape of animals, not just prey but predators, lions, bears, serpents, sometimes rendered with care, sometimes distorted, as if emerging from a half-formed vision. These might have been warnings or lessons, or attempts to absorb the essence of the creature. When a man carved the beast that had almost killed him, was he honouring it? Was he trying to understand it? Or was he claiming his survival? There is no answer. Only the trace of thought burned into bone. Other carvings were more abstract. Lines crossing lines, spirals, ladders, repetitions that seemed to echo rhythms of walking, breathing, fire crackling. Some archaeologists propose that these were early meditations, not in silence but in shape. A way to hold focus when speech was not enough. To carve a spiral in ivory with a flint blade is not efficient. It is not productive. It is devotional. It requires stillness, repetition, intention. In that sense, these marks are as close to prayer as anything we can still touch. And in some cases, the carving may have come after loss. Objects left beside the dead. Blades with etched handles, pendants with markings. Tools that had clearly been used but were now offered up in stillness. This was not about utility. It was about presence. To bury a carved tool with a fallen brother was to say, "You are not just gone, you are carried." The object held both use and meaning. It spoke on behalf of the one who no longer could. Even in death, the marks endured. Some of the best preserved engravings are found in graves, protected from weather, wrapped in soil. When unearthed, they remain sharp, intact. A message that was never meant for us, yet still found its way here. This continuity is not accidental. It is testament to the man who chose to mark, to the hand that held the tool, to the moment when breath paused long enough for thought to become pattern. These were not decorations. They were declarations, not of power but of presence. A man may be gone, but if he carved, he left something that says I was not only alive, I was aware, and that awareness mattered. In a world where injury came quickly and remembrance came slowly, if it came at all, the decision to shape the world, even slightly, was an act of resistance. Not against death itself, but against its finality. These men didn't live long on average. They broke. They bled. They disappeared into ice and river and ash. But through the grooves they left behind, we know they once paused, considered, chose. To carve is to interrupt time. It is to slow the present long enough to impress meaning into the future. For Ice Age men, surrounded by a world in constant motion, of herds, storms, migrations, threats, carving may have been the only moment they fully owned. Not just action, reflection, the mark of a self not merely reacting but reaching. And though these marks rarely formed language, they still spoke. They spoke of thought, of intention, of memory. When a flint blade catches the edge of bone and leaves behind a pattern, just says, I saw this, I touched this, I made this different than it was before, even if no one else sees it, even if it is buried, even if it fades. Not every man carved. Some left no physical trace. But even that silence is part of the story. Survival had many forms. Some built shelters, some broke trails. Some watched, some marked. The act of carving was not better, only visible, and in being visible it gives us a bridge, a way to reach backward through unspoken millennia and touch the mind of another man who faced the cold and chose to speak anyway, without words. Perhaps that is what makes these carvings sacred, not their perfection, but their persistence. They were not made in ease. They were made under duress, in hunger, in fatigue, in pain, and still they were made. That is their power, not beauty, not clarity, but endurance. Even now, when we run our fingers across those old grooves, we do not erase them, we renew them. We bring breath back to the pattern, we continue a dialogue that began before memory and may never end. That is how identity survives, not in fame, but in form, not in speech, but in shape. The man is gone, the clan is scattered, the land has changed, but still, the line remains, and somewhere, in that line, his name is written, not in letters, but in the patience it took to leave it behind. What happens when there is no one left to carve? When the hand stills not from age, but from extinction? When the line breaks? This is not myth, not poetry, it is fact, encrypted in blood. Hidden in the fragile loops of DNA that each of us carry. There, between the strands, is a silence no one speaks about. The missing names, the vanished lines, whole branches of the male tree that once walked, hunted, carved, and then disappeared. Not gradually, not with grace, but abruptly, as if something chose them, or unchose them. Geneticists call it a bottleneck, but that word is too smooth, too clean. What it means is this. Around 50,000 years ago, something happened that erased most male lineages from the earth. Not all humans, just men. Women passed on mitochondrial lines broadly. But the Y chromosome, it narrowed. Collapsed, went silent. A sudden pruning of ancestral possibility, a collapse of voices, and this was not the only time. The genetic record reveals multiple events like this, moments when, across continents, male genetic diversity plunged, not slowly, but like a cliff. From many to few. Why? There is no single answer. Perhaps climate, which shattered food webs and split groups apart. Perhaps warfare. Perhaps social structure, where only a few males reproduced while others died or vanished unremembered. Perhaps all of it. A cascade of silence. The bones do not tell us everything, but some speak. In layers dated to these time frames, there are sites with overwhelming male fatalities, trauma patterns, overkill, whole groups buried, no signs of survival. In others, there is only absence. A camp once inhabited, now empty. A line once carried, now cut. What we know is this: survival was not guaranteed, not even to the strong, especially not to the strong if strength meant exposure. Ice Age men lived close to the edge, of cold, of hunger, of conflict, and the edge gave no mercy. The wrong storm, the wrong wound, the wrong group, and a lineage ended quietly, forever. It is easy to look back and see only the ones who lasted, the victors, the fathers of fathers. But they are only a shard. The truth is that most did not make it. Most were lost, and not because they were weak, but because the world was wild and survival was never fair. What does it mean to be the last of a line? To carry a name that no one else will inherit? To vanish, not with fire, but with no one left to remember you ever burned? This is the shape of male extinction. It does not howl. It does not announce itself. It accrues in percentages, in the slow disappearance of certain sequences from the genome, in the way modern men, across vast regions, trace back to a handful of ancient fathers, not because there were only a few men then, but because the others were erased, their lineages broken, their sons never born, their names never passed. One study of Y chromosome diversity showed that, around 7,000 years ago, in some regions, up to 90% of male lines vanished. Not gradually, but in a blink, in evolutionary terms, and yet mitochondrial diversity among women stayed wide. That difference matters. It tells us that the collapse wasn't species-wide. It was gendered, selective. Something about being male made you more expendable, more vulnerable to history's blade. Why? The causes are layered. Some are ecological. As climates shifted and ice retreated, the hunting strategies that once favoured endurance and high-risk cooperation may have turned deadly. Men travelled farther, exposed themselves longer. When the prey changed, the men who specialised in chasing it fell with it. This was not failure. This was pattern. Environment as filter. One wrong pressure, and 1,000 years of lineage can disappear. Some filters were social. Hierarchies began to form, not rigid like later civilizations, but enough to skew reproduction. In certain forager groups, it's likely that a few men fathered most children while others had none. This wasn't necessarily cruelty. It may have been cultural, a product of leadership, status, reputation. But the result was the same. Many men's genetic lines stopped with them, even if they lived long lives. There is also evidence of violent collapse. Mass graves with exclusively male skeletons, sites where adolescent boys were systematically killed. Whether through conflict, conquest, or internal culling, the record shows that men were often the first to die when pressure rose. And when they died in clusters, their lineage went with them. The mothers remained. The children were sometimes absorbed, but the male line, gone. This is not mythology. It is etched in DNA. When scientists sequence modern populations, they find bottlenecks where thousands of potential ancestors narrow into dozens, or fewer. These aren't only survival stories. They are stories of loss, of silenced futures, of men who walked, hunted, carved, and carried, and whose bloodlines ended before memory began. To know this is to see survival differently, not as triumph, but as chance, as lottery, as storm and silence. You're not here because your ancestors were strongest. You're here because they were among the few who were not erased, and even they carried the burden. Survival did not come without cost. The Y-line, passed from father to son, carried more than inheritance. It carried the memory of absence. Every genetic bottleneck, every lost brother line narrowed not only the tree of ancestry, but the shape of possibility. Fewer voices, fewer mutations, fewer ways to adapt. Over time, this left the male genome more exposed, less buffered, more fragile, like a rope stretched thinner with each strand lost. We tend to think of extinction as dramatic, a falling meteor, a roaring beast, a flood. But male extinction happened in the quiet, in a failed courtship, in a missed hunt, in the moment a man was wounded too far from camp to return, in wars that left women alive but no men old enough to pass on their name. It was not always sudden. Sometimes it was the slow attrition of risk, born generation after generation, a soft chipping away of lineage, And still, some held on, through alliances, through chance, through adaptation. Some men fathered children not because they dominated, but because they endured. They were stable, available, chosen. Sometimes, in times of turmoil, it was not the boldest who reproduced, but the quietest. The man who returned to camp with smaller prey but more often, the one who helped tend the fire when the others were away, the one who stayed alive when others did not. This too is a lesson from the broken lines, that masculinity is not fixed, it bends, it adapts, it survives not just through might, but through flexibility, through care, through timing, through proximity. The Y chromosome we carry today is not a symbol of conquest. It is a relic of narrow margins, a trace of those who slipped through the cracks of extinction. It carries the memory not only of fathers, but of all the men who did not get to be. And so we must ask, what does it mean that they vanished? That their genes did not pass on? Do they matter less? Are they forgotten? No, they are the shape of the silence around us, the backdrop against which survival gained meaning. Every man who lived and did not pass on his line still built the world that allowed others to. He hunted, he bled, he held the perimeter, he warned of the lion, he dug the pit. He may not have carved his name, but he carved the path. In that sense, extinction does not mean erasure. It means contribution without continuation, and that is its own kind of legacy, a lineage of impact, not inheritance. A man who was the last of his line still mattered, because survival was never just about who reproduced. It was also about who stood watch when others slept, who held the line when the wolves approached, who gathered wood in the snow, or stitched a wound, or carried a wounded companion through the pass. These stories are not written in the genome. They do not show up in bloodlines or percentages, but they shape the possibility of survival just the same. Extinction, then, is not a measure of worth. It is a measure of exposure, of vulnerability, of what it means to be male in a system that rewards certain risks but rarely forgives them. The men who vanished from the tree of ancestry did not vanish from history. They are its quiet architects, its missing architects. Their lives made space for others, and their absence made the survivors visible. We see it in the narrowing of lines, the collapse from many branches to one, but we also see it in the trauma buried in bone, in the fracture lines across male forearms, in the arrowheads embedded in ribs, in the uneven burial patterns that show which bodies were honoured and which were left in haste. Some of these men died without kin to mourn them. Some died in distant places, carrying their names far from home, only for those names to end in silence. But even silence carries weight, and sometimes those last men, the ends of their lines, knew. There are carvings found in deep cave zones, far from living spaces, that show a lone handprint or an isolated mark, not part of a pattern, not ritual, just presence, alone. It is tempting to romanticize this, but perhaps it is even more powerful not to. Perhaps it was simply a man sitting with the knowledge that there would be no sons to carry his fire, and still choosing to leave a mark. That is not weakness. That is the purest form of resistance. A refusal to be erased, even when continuation is impossible. And that too was part of Ice Age masculinity. The courage to face erasure without panic, without performance, to meet the end of the line and still contribute something, not to genes but to memory, to myth, to the unspoken heritage of what it means to endure. Because the truth is, most lines end. Statistically, genetically, eventually, almost every male lineage that ever lived has gone silent. The branches we follow today are just those that pass through a narrow gate. That gate was not a reward. It was an accident, a filter, a scar, and still, someone made it through. Carrying not just their own story, but the weight of all those who didn't. That is the inheritance we carry now. Not pride, but memory. Not dominance, but persistence. We are the result of narrow corridors and vanished crowds. Every man alive today stands on a foundation built just as much by absence as by ancestry. And if we forget that, we mistake survival for success. We imagine continuity where there was once collapse. The truth is sharper. To be born male in the Ice Age was to live close to extinction, not in metaphor but in math, to know that the odds were not in your favour, that your survival did not guarantee your legacy. that no matter how hard you worked, how far you travelled, how many beasts you brought down, your line could still vanish in a single season of frost or fever or war. And yet they kept going. The men of the Pleistocene carved and hunted and taught, not because they were sure of being remembered, but because the act itself was worthwhile. A gesture of meaning in a world that offered no guarantees. The marks they left, on tools, on walls, on the bones of animals and sometimes themselves, were not declarations of triumph. They were quiet proofs of presence, of having existed at all. That's what makes the missing lines so haunting. They were here, and then they weren't. They carried fire, they sang, they made things with their hands, they survived storms and buried their dead and stood watch in the dark. And then, one day, the chain ended. A child not born, a name not passed, a silence that stretched forward, generation by generation, until only the absence remained. But absence is not emptiness. It is outline, it is contour, it is the shape that allows presence to be seen. The vanished men, the extinct lines, are part of our story not because they lasted, but because they did not. Because their ending reminds us of the narrow ledge we stand on still. And so, to look at the surviving Y chromosome lines is not to see power. It is to see fragility, to see how close we came to vanishing. How often the future trembled on the edge of oblivion, and how many times it was only luck, or love, or shelter, or mercy, that pulled a line back from the brink. When the line broke, it did not end the story. It reshaped it. It asked a harder question. Not just, who survived? But, what does survival mean when so many did not? And what do we owe to the ones whose names we will never know? Perhaps we owe them this, the question of what comes next, because survival is not a static thing. It mutates, just like the land it depends on. And when the ice began to retreat, the shape of survival began to shift. Glaciers pulled back in stuttering rhythms, revealing valleys drowned in meltwater, new forests unfurling, old prey dissolving into memory. The climate softened, but not gently. It fractured, stuttered, and with it, the patterns of life that had sustained men for tens of thousands of years began to fail. The megafauna vanished. The mammoths that once thundered across the steppe, the woolly rhinos that once fed entire bands, they withdrew, not into legend, but into extinction. And the men who had once followed them, patterned their identity around them, now found themselves out of sync with the world that remained. Strength, size, endurance, the very traits that had carved one kind of man, became less central, not useless, but unmoored from their old purpose. In place of giants came swarms, hares, birds, fish. The hunt turned from spectacle to subtlety. Toolkits adapted. Where once broad, fluted spear points dominated, now came microliths, barbed arrows, nets and traps. A quieter kind of killing. Less glory, more yield. Men who had once sprinted across tundra now crouched by rivers, or moved silently through undergrowth, listening for feathers, watching for footprints. The tempo of survival had changed, and with it the tempo of manhood. Even food itself began to shift. It was no longer only about flesh. There were nuts to store, roots to dig, grains to scatter. Men began to preserve, to plan, to spend longer in one place, to trade movement for memory. Some learned to shape clay, others traced the sky. The male role, once tightly bound to blood and force, began to stretch into abstraction, into patience, into repetition, into care. This was not universal. The shift unfolded unevenly, rippling across continents in waves. Some bands clung to the old ways, their tools and tempo unchanged, but others bent, and in bending, endured. Those men passed their skills on not through ritualized bravado, but through quieter instruction, through firelight demonstration, through the first hints of settlement, through teaching not how to kill, but how to stay. And this is where the deeper transformation began. Not only in muscle or in tool, but in identity. Men began to define themselves not just by what they hunted, but by what they built, what they preserved, what they remembered. The cold had forged a body, but the melting asked for something else, a mind that could see beyond today's hunger. a hand that could shape not only weapons, but symbols. A new kind of man was beginning to appear, not stronger, but different. Different not in how he bled or burned calories, but in what he noticed, in what he carried forward, in what he passed down not through lineage but through repetition, through attention, through culture. Because as the earth thawed, time itself began to feel slower, less dictated by hunger, more guided by rhythm. And in that space, that slackening of urgency, something astonishing happened. Men began to stay. Not all at once, not everywhere, but in some places the pattern of motion fractured. Where once they followed herds, now they began to follow cycles of plants, of fish, of season and soil. They mapped the behaviours of birds. They watched the sky not just for storms but for signs. The first stones were placed not as weapons but as boundaries, markers, memory made visible. This was not yet farming, but it was something ancestral to it, a soft tethering of man to place. And with place came a new kind of pressure. In motion there is escape, but in staying there is structure, and structure demands roles. Men, who had long been generalists of survival, hunters, builders, fighters, began to specialise. Some grew adept at shaping tools no longer just for killing, but for crafting. Others memorised seasonal cues or practised healing. These were not professions, not yet, but they were seeds. The beginning of differentiated male identity not just by age or strength, but by contribution. This was the birth of symbolic masculinity. In Firelight the stories changed. They still honoured endurance, still praised bravery. But they also began to include wisdom, insight, a man who could foresee the winter, who could dream a path before it existed. Around the same time, male figures appear more frequently in symbolic contexts, etched into bone, modelled in clay, carved in stone, sometimes paired with animals, sometimes wearing masks, sometimes ambiguous, but always there, not as dominance, but as memory, as representation. This suggests something subtle, a shift from surviving to being remembered, from reacting to shaping. Men began not only to adapt to the world, but to interpret it, to encode experience into form, into rhythm, into line, into myth. The tool became message, the gesture became ritual, and in that layering something internal began to shift. It was no longer enough to endure the cold, one had to leave a trace. But this trace was different from the handprint of a man who knew he would be the last of his line. This was not elegy. This was legacy. The ice had stripped life down to bone and breath, but the thaw brought choices, and in those choices the definition of manhood stretched. Not weaker, not softer, just wider. And in that widening, the story of men became more than survival. It became meaning, not imposed from above, but carved from within. This new kind of man was not born overnight. He emerged slowly, layered in habit, necessity and vision. One change gave rise to another. As the megafauna disappeared and the hunt became less central, the emotional world of men began to shift as well. No longer defined solely by danger and adrenaline, male identity found new anchors in rhythm, in relationship, in repetition. Some of the oldest musical instruments in the archaeological record come from this time. Flutes made from bird bone, drums carved from hollow wood and stretched hide. These weren't made for combat or coordination in battle. They were made for something else, for echo, for trance, for shared attention, for gathering under stars not to plan a hunt, but to experience sound together. This too was survival, a different kind, not through force, but through cohesion. Men, once scattered across the landscape in pursuit of game, began to gather more regularli. Sites like Göbekli Tepe, built before agriculture, suggest a kind of ritual centrality. Male figures are prominent in the iconography, not dominating but integrated, part of a symbolic system where masculinity was no longer purely functional, but ceremonial. This doesn't mean society became patriarchal. It means male roles expanded to include meaning-making. With this expansion came a deeper emotional complexity. For to remain in one place, to build something that outlasts the body, is also to become more vulnerable. Bonds grow, so do losses. A man rooted in place becomes exposed in new ways, to grief, to memory, to the consequences of his own actions, and yet he stays. He tends the fire, he shapes the tool, he teaches the boy, he marks the stone. This emotional labour, quiet, unspoken, was as critical as any spear. Because in a world no longer governed by constant movement, the human mind needed new scaffolding, stories, symbols, routines, and men, far from being purely physical actors, became builders of those frameworks, not alone, not in opposition to women, but as part of a shifting pattern of survival where identity itself became a shared inheritance. We see this in burial sites where grave goods become more complex. Men are interred not just with weapons, but with carvings, pigments, tokens, objects that suggest status, yes, but also story, memory, roles beyond utility, perhaps teacher, perhaps guide, perhaps elder. So the man who once ran after mammoths now sits beside a child, pressing ochre into the child's palm. He shows him how to grind pigment, how to chip stone, not because the child must survive tomorrow, but because he must remember what came before. This too is a kind of masculinity, one not forged in blood, but in the soft transfer of knowledge. And yet it was no less demanding, because to teach is also to reflect. To guide another through the slow arc of learning requires patience, restraint, and memory. It demands a different kind of courage, not the courage to charge, but the courage to stay still, to remain present across seasons, and to witness the changes not just in the world, but in the people beside you. Men who had once lived in a constant state of reaction, to prey, to weather, to threat, now had to cultivate response. They had to become stewards of time rather than merely survivors within it. This shift is visible in the archaeological record not just through tools and art, but through architecture. Hearths became more central. Storage pits appeared. Settlement traces expanded in duration. And as permanence took root, so too did new emotional obligations. To stay in one place is to live with the consequences of your actions, to be remembered not for the kill, but for the consistency, for showing up day after day, even when the hunt was gone. In some cultures, this role crystallized into new forms of male responsibility, keepers of fire, of stories, of shared rhythm. Men became more than muscle, they became continuity. This redefinition was not universal, nor was it always smooth. Old instincts remained. Violence did not vanish. Competition still surfaced, especially in regions where resources grew scarce. But even these conflicts began to take on more symbolic structure, mediated through ritual, expressed through performance, constrained by group memory. The raw edge of survival had been dulled, and in its place grew something more refined: social resilience. This was a different kind of survival, slower but no less vital, a survival of structure, a survival of meaning, and men who had once thrived on motion now had to learn to thrive on rhythm. On seasons that repeated, on stories told again and again beside the same fire. This is when the father, the elder, and the ancestor began to emerge as roles of masculine significance. Not just the hunter, but the one who remembers the ice, the one who explains the marks on the stone, the one who says this is where we buried him. And in these slow acts of remembrance, a new kind of man took root, not less resilient than his Ice Age forefathers, but shaped by a different burden. The burden of reflection, of transmission, of imagining the future not as a threat to outrun, but as a shape to be guided. He did not forget the mammoth. He carved it, he painted it, he told the boy what it sounded like across the plain, because to preserve the past was to survive in a new way, and perhaps that was the hardest lesson of all. That survival was no longer about outlasting nature, but about outlasting the self. The end of the Ice Age didn't just change the land, it changed the logic of being male. In the new world, strength without foresight became a liability, motion without purpose became waste, and silence without meaning became forgettable. So men began to craft memory, not just through oral traditions or carvings, but through a deeper sense of continuity, a recognition that survival was not enough, that to matter one had to become part of something larger. This was the birth of ancestry not just as lineage, but as story. It was no longer enough to be born and endure. One had to be remembered for something more than pain. In sites like Lepenski Vir, Çatalhöyük, and later Jericho, we find evidence of communities where men contributed not as solo providers, but as part of patterned symbolic systems. They helped build homes, they shaped walls, they traced meaning across time through art and position and repetition. Their identities became inseparable from place, from structure, from the rhythms of others. Even masculinity itself became layered. A man could now be many things. Strong, yes, but also wise. A hunter, but also a teacher. A builder, a father, a craftsman, a dreamer. This flexibility did not erase old traits. It absorbed them. It made space for new responses, emotional literacy, adaptability, memory. And in that flexibility was survival, because the men who could not change vanished. The ones who could not loosen their grip on the old ways were gradually left behind, either by extinction or by irrelevance. But those who allowed the definition of manhood to bend, they became the rootstock of something new. They allowed the memory of the ice to be carried forward not just in muscle or tool, but in thought, in pattern, in story. This is what the new kind of man carried. Not just the skills to feed a family or defend a group, but the deeper, quieter labour of holding time together. He was no longer merely a body in motion, chasing prey across a cold horizon. He became a thread between past and future, a symbol carver, a rhythm holder, a presence that endured not through force but through meaning. And when he sat beside the fire, older now, not chasing, not boasting, and told the boy about the cold, the beasts, the deaths, and the change, he was not teaching how to hunt. He was teaching how to stay, how to carry memory through rupture, how to be human in a world that kept shifting beneath their feet. He had once survived the ice. Now he was surviving time. Yet time, too, is a predator. It strips away what cannot hold. It buries stories. It silences names. And so, what remains is not the whole of their lives, but what refused to decay. The bone, the stone, the ash. These are the final witnesses. The quiet record of what men once carried, once built, once endured. And in their silence, we begin to listen differently. There is no triumph in a femur worn down by decades of strain, no glory in a shattered rib or in the arthritis etched into a spine. But these marks are the legacy of survival. They tell us that men walked far, hauled weight, bore injury, healed unevenly. They tell us not who these men were as individuals, but what it cost to remain alive. The burden was not symbolic, it was physical. Compressed joints, repeated fractures, teeth worn to the root, hands reshaped by years of carving, lifting, dragging, gripping, and sometimes they died before their time. Skulls show signs of fatal blows, arms bent in defence, wounds that never closed. But often it is the more mundane damage that speaks loudest, the evidence of wear, the slow attrition of bodies shaped by necessity, not ease. And this tells us something profound. Masculinity in the Ice Age was not about domination. It was about endurance. It was about lasting long enough to pass something on. But bones do not survive in isolation. Around them, we find traces of care. Carefully arranged burial positions, objects tucked beside the dead, hearthstones that had burned long before cooling. And it is here, in these quiet arrangements, that another kind of legacy emerges. Not just the story of pain, but of meaning, of intentional space, of design. For Ice Age men were not only shaped by the cold, they shaped their world in return. They placed stones in patterns. They cleared floors. They angled shelters toward the sun. They reinforced walls, dug drainage paths, stacked firewood to survive the wind. These acts were not instinctive. They were chosen. They required foresight, planning, cooperation, and that makes them architectural. Not in the grand sense, but in the way that matters most, building space to endure together. Even the tools found beside them tell stories of purpose, not prestige. Worn handles, repeated sharpening, signs of use, not display. These were not ornaments, they were lifelines. And when they are buried with the dead, it is not to show wealth, it is to acknowledge the cost of what they gave, to the group, to the shelter, to the fire. Their bones remain, and they do not speak. But everything around them does. Fire pits hold more than heat. Their layers tell of repeated use, of community returning to the same spot night after night, season after season. The charcoal changes over time, from pine to birch to oak, reflecting not just fuel, but memory. Here is where he sat. Here is where they cooked. Here is where the child cried, and the old man coughed, and someone reached for another branch to keep the warmth from dying. Fire was not only survival, it was presence, and presence, in a place where everything moved, meant something. In this stillness we find the labour of memory. Flat stones used as work surfaces, worn smooth by countless hours of grinding. Post holes that once held the ribs of shelters. Midden heaps where discarded bones reveal not just diet but rhythm. How often the hunt succeeded, how many mouths needed feeding, what was saved and what was shared. These are the traces not of chaos, but of system. Hidden under soil, they tell us that Ice Age men did not merely react to nature, they constructed order within it, and inside that order lived ritual, some of it visible, ochre stains in graves, perforated pendants, antler carvings, and some of it implied, the arrangement of bodies, the deliberate breakage of tools, the careful placement of objects beside the dead. These acts were not accidents, they were signals, messages to the living, or perhaps to something beyond the living. Either way, they reveal a desire to communicate, to mark, to say, this man mattered. And if he mattered, then we must look again at who he was, not as a type, but as a person in time, a man who slept beside others, who carved a tool with care, who carried a child, who stood in a storm and checked the shelter's edge. The bones do not show his voice, but they do show his labour, his damage, his routine. And within that routine we glimpse something recognisable, because the burden of being male in prehistory was not just strength or silence, it was responsibility. To endure not only one's own pain, but the risk of others, to watch the horizon, to take the first step into the cold, to fail and try again, because someone else was waiting near the fire. The grave does not record those moments, but the wear on the knees, the scars on the ribs, the grooves in the stone beside him, they do. They are the quiet accounting of a life spent holding others in place, not with dominance, but with presence, a presence that outlived the man himself and now rests fossilized beneath our feet. And yet that presence is easy to overlook. In museums, the bones are arranged on neutral backgrounds. Their tools are laid out in glass. The names on the placards are species, not stories. We are taught to see them as types, as stages in a long evolutionary climb. But if we pause, if we look not with curiosity but with respect, a different image begins to emerge. These were not symbols. These were people, men who had to make sense of a world that asked everything of them and offered little certainty in return. The bones do not tell us what he feared. They cannot say what he hoped, but they tell us where his tendons pulled, where his spine compressed, where the edge of his tool pressed again and again into calloused palms. This is the geography of survival etched into the body itself, and beside it, sometimes, a carving, a mark, a gesture made not for function but for meaning, something that says, I was here. The earliest engravings are not elaborate, they are lines, repeats, curves and dots and spirals, but they are consistent, found across regions and years, on bone and stone and antler. Some were made by women, others by men, but many carry the rhythm of labour, marks etched into objects of daily use, not set aside but lived with. The repetition suggests more than idle carving. It hints at pattern, intention, perhaps even memory. In these marks, we may be seeing the birth of identity made durable. To carve is to decide that something is worth remembering. And men who had once carried everything on their backs began to carry ideas in their hands. They etched animals, tools, shapes. Some images seem practical, others feel ritualistic. But all of them say something about attention, about a moment slowed, a thought captured. And in a world ruled by movement, that pause was powerful. The Ice Age did not reward distraction. Every decision had weight. To mark a surface with deliberate lines meant spending time, energy, focus. It meant you believed the mark mattered. And so when we find those marks in caves, on tusks, along spear shafts or in burial sites, we must read them not just as art, but as insistence, a quiet human insistence that says, Even in a world this cold, this vast, this dangerous, I chose to make something last. And that desire to leave a trace, to push against forgetting, is perhaps the clearest link we have to them. We do not share their terrain, or their tools, or their risks, but we share that urge to shape something into meaning, to take the ordinary, bone, stone, time, and render it unforgettable. Not because it was grand, but because it was real, because it was lived, because it was theirs. And now it is ours to interpret, not just as researchers or viewers, but as descendants of a long buried, unfinished lineage. When we look into these remains, we are not peering at the past as a foreign place. We are recognizing echoes, the pain etched into their joints, the marks of exhaustion in their spines, the hidden injuries healed over by time. These are not distant curiosities. They are evidence of men who kept going, even when their bodies were giving out. Evidence of loyalty, of pressure, of a role accepted without applause. Masculinity in prehistory was not a theatre of dominance, it was a labour of constancy. It meant walking further than your strength allowed, carrying more than was fair, staying outside longer than was safe. It meant entering risk so others didn't have to, and it meant doing it not once but every day without promise of success. When we see that, we understand that survival was not heroism, it was maintenance. It was the slow, silent effort of showing up again and again for people who depended on you. And yet, there was more to it than endurance. There was coordination, there was structure. Fire circles were arranged for warmth, yes, but also for conversation. Sleeping positions were chosen not only for safety, but for connection. The placement of tools, of food, of ritual objects, it all suggests an awareness of space that went beyond instinct. These arrangements were forms of care, of shared memory. They were how men made environments feel familiar in a world that was constantly changing. In that familiarity came resilience. When ice expanded or prey vanished, it was not strength alone that kept people alive. It was knowledge passed from one man to the next, how to brace a shelter, how to read tracks in thawing ground, when to move and when to stay. These lessons were not written down. They were taught by gesture, by repetition, by presence. They lived in the body before they lived in words. And so when we find a stone blade shaped just so, when we see that it fits perfectly in a hand, that it was resharpened many times, that it was buried beside someone who once held it, we are not just looking at a tool, we are looking at memory made solid. We are seeing what that man held onto until the very end. He did not write a name, he did not build a monument, but he left behind something shaped by his choices, something that tells us he was there, that he contributed, that he mattered, not for how loudly he lived, but for how deeply, and through that depth he remains, not as a statue, not as a myth, but as a set of choices embedded in the world he helped shape. And when we listen closely, that world still whispers, not with words, but with arrangements. The curved line of a hearth still visible beneath layers of soil, the strange, deliberate placement of a bone carved with dots, the smooth stone placed beside a man's left hand, worn on one side more than the other. These are not random, they are the residue of thought, of routine, of meaning. And they ask something of us, not just to observe, but to witness. To witness is to understand that survival is not only measured by what remains, but by what those remains still evoke. These were not empty shells. They were once warm, moving, hungry, laughing. They felt fear, pride, fatigue, and the strange calm that comes after fire is lit, and everyone is safe for one more night. That is what survives. Not just in bone, but in recognition. Because if we are quiet, if we are still, we begin to see ourselves in them, not as perfect reflections, but as part of the same pattern. We too carry burdens that cannot be seen. We move through roles shaped by forces older than language. We inherit expectations, respond to danger, make sacrifices for people who will never fully know what it cost us. This is not prehistoric. This is human. And so the Ice Age men, long reduced to fragments and outlines in textbooks, begin to return. Not as symbols of brute strength, but as kin, as predecessors who found a way to live through unlivable cold, who built meaning from endurance, who turned exposure into memory and memory into ritual, who survived not because they conquered, but because they held on. Their bones are not loud. They do not tell grand stories, but they tell honest ones. They tell of backs bent too early, of hands that didn't heal right, of nights without fire and mornings with frost in the lungs. And they also tell of closeness, of men buried near each other, of shared tools, of scars that came from shielding someone else. This is the story beneath all the noise, beneath the modern myths of strength and dominance. What the archaeological record reveals, again and again, is not power, but perseverance, not arrogance, but adaptation. The story of Ice Age men is not one of easy glory. It is one of survival, written in damage and care. And when we leave them, when we walk away from the grave sites, the caves, the tools behind the glass, we carry something invisible with us, a quiet understanding. That masculinity was never just about strength. It was about staying, about carrying the weight, about building something that could last longer than the body that made it. And now that story rests quietly in their bones. Thank you for walking this long road through the ice, through the silence, the labour, the memory carved into stone and rib. Fellow sapiens, thank you for staying with us through the quiet burden carried by men who had only endurance to leave behind. If this story helped you feel a little more grounded, or offered a new perspective on what it means to survive without recognition, or simply gave your thoughts a place to rest, then your time here was deeply valued. Thank you for sharing it with us. I wonder what part of this story will remain with you tonight. A word, a wound, or perhaps the shape of a hand pressed into ancient ash. Whether it was the mark left by a worn blade in a man's palm, the soundless message of a grave's arrangement, or the memory of fire shared in the dark, these fragments are what quietly connect us across time. If something stayed with you, feel free to leave it in the comments, not as a reply, but as a quiet offering to others on the same path. If you'd like to keep travelling through stories like this, consider subscribing. There are more forgotten roads to follow, and more echoes waiting to be uncovered. Until next time, stay curious, stay thoughtful,